The boy's bare feet were bleeding when he grabbed the stranger's reins. "Please, mister, they're taking me tomorrow. Judge says my mama ain't fit." Caleb Drummond had ridden into Montana to disappear, not to save anyone. But something in the child's grip, desperate, unashamed, cracked through years of careful isolation. Up the hill, a widow fought a system built to crush her. Down in town, a judge held the law like a weapon, and between them stood one drifter with a past he'd never speak and a choice he couldn't escape: ride on or finally stand still. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and settle in, because what happens next will break your heart before it puts it back together. The Montana sky stretched wide and indifferent, the kind of blue that made a man feel small. Caleb Drummond had learned to prefer it that way. He'd been riding north for 3 weeks, following the spine of the Rockies where towns thinned out and questions grew scarce. His saddlebags carried jerky, coffee, a bedroll, and nothing that could tie him to a name anyone might remember. The horse beneath him, a steady roan mare he'd traded for in Wyoming, knew the rhythm of a man who didn't plan to stop. The river crossing appeared just after noon, a wide, shallow ford where the water ran clear over smooth stones. Caleb dismounted, let the mare drink, and filled his canteen. The sound of the current was the only conversation he'd had in days, and he preferred it that way. He was tightening the canteen strap when he heard the running footsteps. The boy came down the bank fast, stumbling over roots, arms pumping. He couldn't have been more than 8, skinny as a fence post, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. His feet were bare, cut, and dirty, and he didn't slow down until he reached Caleb's horse and grabbed the reins with both hands. "Mister, please," the boy's voice cracked with desperation. "Please, you gotta help my mama." Caleb's hand went instinctively to the rifle on his saddle, then stopped. The child wasn't a threat. He was shaking, breath coming in gasps, fingers white-knuckled on the leather. Caleb studied him with the careful neutrality of a man who'd made it a habit not to get involved. "Son, I don't know you or your mama. Let go of my horse." "They're taking me tomorrow." The boy's words tumbled out in a rush. "Judge Henley says mama ain't fit to keep me. Says the ranch is falling down and she can't provide proper care." "But it ain't true, mister. Mama works harder than anybody. She just needs help, and nobody in town will give it because the judge—" "Let go." Caleb's voice was flat, final. He'd heard stories like this before, in a dozen towns across a dozen territories. Widows fighting land grabs, judges on the take, children caught in the middle. It always ended the same way, and getting in the middle of it only meant adding your own name to the list of casualties. The boy didn't let go. His eyes locked on Caleb's, and there was something in them, not just fear, but a fierce, stubborn refusal to quit, that made Caleb pause. "My name's Eli Carter. My mama's Mara Carter. Our ranch is 2 miles up that hill." He pointed east toward a ridge thick with pine. "Judge is coming with the sheriff tomorrow morning to take me to the orphanage in Helena. Once I'm gone, Mama loses the land. That's what they want, the land. There's something wrong with the water from the mine, and Papa knew it before he died, and now they're trying to make sure nobody can prove it." Caleb felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the one that came whenever the world asked him to care. He'd spent years learning how to set that weight down and keep riding. He reached for the reins. "Your fight's not mine, boy." "I know." Eli's voice dropped, but he didn't let go. "But if you ride away, I got nobody else to ask." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the river's murmur and the mare's soft breathing. Caleb looked at the boy's bleeding feet, at the threadbare shirt, at the desperation held in check by nothing but sheer will. He thought about the empty miles ahead, the anonymous campsites, the cold coffee, and colder nights. He thought about how easy it would be to pull the reins free and never look back. Then he thought about the kind of man who could do that and still call himself one. 2 miles, you said? Eli's face transformed, hope flooding in so fast it was almost painful to watch. "Yes, sir. Up the ridge road. You'll see the fence line. Needs mending, but it's there." Caleb swung back into the saddle, and Eli scrambled up behind him without waiting for an invitation. The boy's arms wrapped around his waist, and Caleb felt the trembling that came from more than just exertion. He nudged the mare into a walk, aiming for the ridge. "I ain't promising anything," Caleb said. I'll look. That's all. That's more than anybody else done, Eli whispered. The Carter Ranch revealed itself in stages as they climbed. First the broken fence line Eli had mentioned, posts leaning at drunken angles and wire sagging. Then a hay meadow gone mostly to weeds, though someone had tried to cut what grew. Finally the buildings themselves, a small cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that listed slightly to the north, and a chicken coop patched with mismatched lumber. It wasn't prosperity, but it wasn't complete ruin either. It was the kind of place that could go either way, depending on luck and strength and time. A woman stood in the cabin doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was younger than Caleb expected, mid-30s maybe, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a braid and a face that would have been pretty if exhaustion hadn't carved lines around her eyes and mouth. She wore a faded calico dress and boots that had been resoled more than once. When she saw Eli on the back of a stranger's horse, her whole body went rigid. Eli Matthew Carter, where have you been? Her voice carried the sharp edge of fear disguised as anger. I've been looking for you for 2 hours. She stopped as Caleb dismounted, her eyes taking in his worn trail clothes, the rifle, the careful way he moved. Who are you? Mama, he can help. Eli slid down and ran to her. I found him at the river. He's gonna… Eli, go inside. Mara's hand settled on her son's shoulder, protective and firm. But Mama… Inside. Now. The boy's face fell, but he obeyed, casting one last pleading look at Caleb before disappearing into the cabin. Mara waited until the door closed, then took 3 steps forward. She was small, barely came up to Caleb's shoulder, but she held herself like she'd fight if she had to. I don't know what my son told you, mister, but we don't need help from drifters. We're managing fine. Caleb could see the lie in the slump of her shoulders, in the way her hands twisted the apron, in the barely controlled tremor in her voice. He'd gotten good at reading people, at seeing past what they wanted to show. This woman was holding on by her fingernails, and she knew it. Name's Caleb Drummond. Your boy said there's trouble with a judge and a custody hearing. Her jaw tightened. That's our business. Said something about water and a mine. I said it's our business. The words came out harder now, defensive. I appreciate Eli's initiative, but we don't need charity. If you're looking for work, try the lumber camp south of town. Caleb studied her for a long moment. He recognized the pride, the fierce independence that came from being pushed too far and refusing to break. He'd worn it himself for years, but he also recognized something else, the desperate calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing danger against necessity, trying to decide if this stranger was a threat or a last chance. I'm not looking for work, he said quietly, but your fence line's down, your barn needs shoring, and that hay meadow could produce double what it's giving if it was properly tended. I'll work for a week, meals and a place to sleep in the barn, no pay. After the week, I ride on. Mara's eyes narrowed. Why? Does it matter? Yes. She crossed her arms. Nobody works for free. What do you want? Caleb felt the question settle into old scars, the ones he'd thought were healed. What did he want? To stop seeing the faces of people he'd failed? To prove he was something other than the man who'd run when running was easiest? To sleep one night without the dreams that came with too much silence and too much guilt? I want to fix your fence, he said instead. That's all. They stood in the yard while the afternoon sun angled lower, shadows stretching from the pine ridge. Somewhere a crow called. The mare shifted her weight, patient. Mara's expression cycled through suspicion, calculation, and something that might have been hope before she wrestled it back down. 1 week, she finally said. You work dawn to dusk. You eat what we eat, sleep in the barn, and you stay away from my son unless I'm present. After 7 days, you leave. Those are the terms. Agreed. And Mr. Drummond? She waited until he met her eyes. If you're running from something and you bring trouble to my door, I've got my husband's rifle inside and I know how to use it. Yes, ma'am. She held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded curtly and turned toward the cabin. There's a water pump by the barn. Supper's at 6. Don't be late. Caleb watched her go. Saw the way she held her spine straight even as she climbed the porch steps. Saw the tremor in her hand when she reached for the door. She was terrified, he realized. Not of him, of hope. of letting herself believe that help had actually arrived. He led the mare to the barn, found it cleaner than expected despite the lean. Someone had mucked the stalls recently and stacked what little hay there was with military precision. The tack hanging on the wall was old but well-maintained, oiled and mended. A man's saddle sat in the corner, gathering dust but not neglect. Caleb recognized the signs of a woman trying to hold together pieces of a life that had shattered. He unsaddled the mare, rubbed her down, and set her in the empty stall with water and a small measure of hay. Then he walked the property, cataloging what needed doing. The list grew longer with each circuit. Fence posts to replace, wire to restring, barn beams to shore up, roof shingles to patch, the chicken coop door that hung crooked, the garden plot that had been started then abandoned when time or energy ran out. But there was something else too, something that made the hair on his neck prickle. Tracks in the dirt near the fence line, fresh within the day. Boot prints, 2 sets, coming from the road and walking the perimeter before heading back. Someone had been surveying the property and not to admire the view. When the dinner bell rang, an old triangle hanging from the porch beam, Caleb washed at the pump and walked to the cabin. The door was open. Inside, the single room was sparse but scrupulously clean. An iron stove, a rough table with 3 chairs, 2 narrow beds in the corner separated by a curtain, shelves lined with preserves and dry goods. Mara stood at the stove, ladling stew into bowls. Eli sat at the table, watching Caleb with barely contained excitement. "Sit," Mara said, not looking up. "Eli, Grace." The boy bowed his head and mumbled a quick prayer. Caleb remained silent, uncomfortable with the ritual but unwilling to disrespect it. When Eli finished, Mara set bowls in front of them, venison stew with potatoes and carrots, thick and fragrant. A luxury, Caleb realized, given the state of the ranch. She was feeding him from reserves she could barely afford. They ate in silence for several minutes. The stew was good, well-seasoned, the kind of cooking that came from practice and care. Caleb took his time, aware of the boy's eyes on him, of Mara's sidelong glances. Finally, she spoke. "Eli tells me you met at the river." "Yes, ma'am." "He shouldn't have bothered you." "He was scared." Her hand tightened on her spoon. "He had no business airing our troubles to strangers." "Mama," Eli started, but she silenced him with a look. Caleb set down his spoon carefully. "He said there's a hearing tomorrow, Judge Henley." Mara's face went carefully blank. "That's correct." "What are the charges?" "That's not your concern, Mr. Drummond. You're here to work, not to involve yourself in our legal affairs. Hard to work if you're gone and the boy's in Helena." The words landed like a slap. Mara's eyes went bright with anger, or tears, Caleb couldn't tell which. Eli's head dropped, staring at his bowl. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. "My husband died 18 months ago," Mara said finally, her voice controlled to the point of breaking. "Lung fever," the doctor said. "But Thomas was strong. He worked the mine before we bought this place, and something there made him sick. Made a lot of men sick. He kept a journal, documented everything, the coughing, the bloody sputum, the way the water from the mine runoff tasted wrong. He was going to take it to the territorial authorities." "What happened?" "He died 3 days before he could mail the letters." Her jaw worked. "The journal disappeared. Our livestock started getting sick. The well water turned cloudy. When I went to town to complain, I was told we were too close to the mine drainage and should have known better than to build here. But we didn't build here. We bought this ranch from the Hendersons 5 years ago, and the water was clean then." Caleb listened, assembling pieces. "Judge Henley? He has financial interest in the mine. Half the town council does. When I pushed for an investigation, they pushed back, said I was hysterical with grief. Then 2 months ago, they filed a petition with the territorial court claiming I'm unfit, that the ranch is failing, that I can't provide for Eli, that he'd be better off in institutional care." Her voice cracked on the last words. "Tomorrow morning, they're coming to take him. Once he's gone, I'll have 30 days to vacate the property. The land will be auctioned for back taxes I can't pay. How much do you owe?" $240. She laughed, bitter and sharp. "Might as well be $2,000. I've got $18 to my name and a dozen chickens." Eli's shoulders shook silently. Mara reached across the table and gripped his hand, her own knuckles white. Caleb saw the whole picture now. A widow inconvenient to powerful men, a child used as leverage, a land grab wrapped in legal legitimacy. He'd seen it before, in mining towns and cattle country, wherever money flowed and law bent to follow it. "Your husband's journal," Caleb said quietly. "You said it disappeared. You sure about that?" Mara looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Men like your husband, they keep backup records, especially if they know they're going against powerful people. If he was planning to mail letters to territorial authorities, he wouldn't have kept only one copy of his evidence." For the first time since Caleb had arrived, something flickered across Mara's face that wasn't exhaustion or fear. It was calculation, the look of someone who'd been too beaten down to see possibilities but was just desperate enough to start looking again. "Thomas had a hiding place," she said slowly, "in the barn, under the floorboards in the tack room. I checked it after he died, but it was empty. I thought they'd found it." "Did anyone know about it besides you?" "No. He showed me once, said it was in case anything happened." Her eyes widened slightly. "You think there might be something there, after all this time?" "Only one way to find out." They finished the meal quickly, the air charged with fragile possibility. When Mara rose to clear the plates, Caleb stopped her. "I'll help. Faster that way." She hesitated, then nodded. They worked in synchronized silence, Caleb washing while she dried, Eli watching from the table like he was witnessing something miraculous. When the last plate was stacked, Mara lit a lantern. "Show me," she said. They crossed the darkening yard to the barn, Eli trailing behind. Inside, Mara led them to the tack room and pointed to a corner. "There. 3 boards in, 2 boards wide." Caleb knelt and examined the floor. The boards looked identical to all the others, tongue and groove pine worn smooth by years of use. But when he pressed on them, there was the slightest give. He pulled his knife from his boot and worked the blade into the seam, prying gently. The boards lifted, revealing a shallow space beneath. Empty. Mara's face fell. "I told you, they found it." But Caleb was studying the space with a tracker's eye. The dust pattern was wrong, disturbed recently but not 18 months ago. And there, in the back corner, a scrap of oilcloth caught on a nail. "Hand me the lantern." Mara passed it down. Caleb lay flat and reached deep into the space, fingers searching. His hand closed on something hard and rectangular, wrapped in canvas and wedged against a support beam. He pulled it free and sat back, brushing off dust and cobwebs. A journal, wrapped in oilcloth and canvas, the leather cover stained but intact. Mara's breath caught. Thomas's handwriting. Caleb handed it to her, and she opened it with trembling fingers. Page after page of careful notation, dates, symptoms, names of other miners who'd gotten sick, sketches of the mine's drainage system. Chemical observations Thomas Carter clearly didn't have the training to interpret, but had documented anyway with meticulous care. And tucked in the back, a folded map marked with X's and a note in pencil. Water samples buried north fence line, 3 feet down, marked with stones. Evidence they can't deny. "He hid samples," Mara whispered. "He actually buried water samples." Eli pressed against his mother's side, reading over her shoulder. "Does that mean we can prove Papa was right?" "If the samples are still there," Caleb said, "and if they haven't degraded." Mara looked up at him, and for the first time her eyes held something other than barely controlled desperation. They held fire. "Tomorrow morning, first thing, we dig." "Tomorrow morning the judge arrives," Caleb reminded her. "What time's the hearing?" 9 o'clock. At the courthouse in town." "How far?" 8 miles. Caleb calculated distances in daylight. "We dig at dawn. If we find the samples, we take them straight to the hearing, present them as new evidence. Judge Henley will never allow it. He'll say they're inadmissible, that the chain of custody is broken, that doesn't matter what he allows." Caleb's voice was flat, certain. "Matters what people see. You walk into that courthouse with physical evidence your husband died collecting. You speak loud enough that everyone hears it. You make them see you. That changes things. Law's not just what happens in the courtroom. It's what happens in the street after." Mara studied him for a long moment, This stranger who'd ridden in that afternoon and was now mapping her resistance like a military campaign. You've done this before. Fought this kind of fight. Wasn't a question. Caleb didn't answer it. Instead, he stood and dusted off his pants. Get some sleep, Mrs. Carter. We start digging at first light. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He lay in the barn loft, listening to the mice scuttle in the hay, watching moonlight paint silver squares on the floor. The journal lay beside him. Mara had let him borrow it to read through, said she trusted him with it, which felt like the kind of trust he hadn't earned but couldn't refuse. He read Thomas Carter's words by lantern light, saw the progression from concern to certainty to desperation. A good man, Caleb thought, the kind who'd seen wrong and couldn't let it stand, even when letting it stand would have been easier, even when standing up would cost him everything. Around 2 a.m, Caleb heard soft footsteps outside the barn. He went to the loft door, rifle in hand, and saw Mara walking the fence line with her own lantern, her nightgown ghostly in the dark. She stopped at what must have been the north corner, set down the lantern, and stood there for a long time, arms wrapped around herself. Caleb understood. She was saying goodbye to the version of this fight where she stood alone, letting herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she didn't have to. He didn't call out. Some prayers were meant to be private. When dawn broke gray and cold, he was already in the yard with a shovel. Mara emerged from the cabin fully dressed, her hair in a tight braid, her face set with determination. Eli followed, carrying a second shovel nearly as tall as he was. North fence line, Mara said. According to the map, it should be 30 paces from the corner post, marked with a cairn of white stones. They walked in silence, breath misting in the chill air. The fence line ran along the edge of the property where it bordered unclaimed territory, a mix of scrub pine and rocky soil. At 28 paces, they found it. 3 white stones stacked in a small pyramid, half hidden by wild grass. Caleb marked a spot 3 feet square and started digging. The ground was hard, laced with roots, and progress came slowly. Mara spelled him after 15 minutes, attacking the dirt with a ferocity that spoke of 18 months of helplessness finding sudden outlet. Eli raked the dirt aside, his small hands steady. They'd gone down 2 feet when Caleb's shovel hit something that rang hollow. He dropped to his knees and scraped away dirt with his hands, revealing the top of a wooden box well sealed with tar. Together, they pried it from the earth. Inside, wrapped in more oilcloth, 6 glass jars sealed with wax, filled with water samples. Each jar bore a label in Thomas Carter's careful hand. Date, location, source. Mine runoff, creek downstream from mine. Well water from 3 different properties, including the Carter Ranch. Mara lifted one of the jars to the light. The water was cloudy, with a faint greenish tinge and sediment at the bottom. Even sealed and buried for over a year, it looked wrong. Looked poisoned. We've got it, she breathed. We actually have it. Eli whooped, a child's pure joy cutting through the morning quiet. Mara pulled him into a fierce hug, then looked at Caleb with eyes that shone wet in the sunrise. I don't know who you are, Mr. Drummond. I don't know why you stopped at that river or why you're helping us. But thank you. Whatever happens today, thank you. Caleb nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, and busied himself rewrapping the samples. We need to move. It's a 2-hour ride to town, and you want time to clean up before the hearing. They buried the wooden box again, left the cairn as it was, and hurried back to the cabin. Mara changed into her one good dress, dark blue calico with a white collar, and pinned up her hair with shaking hands. Eli scrubbed his face until it shone and put on a shirt that was too small but clean. Caleb saddled the mare and hitched Mara's horse, an older gelding named Samson, to the small wagon. At 7:30, they rolled out of the yard, the precious jars wrapped and cushioned in an old quilt in the wagon bed. The journal rode in Mara's lap, pressed against her chest like armor. Eli sat between them, vibrating with nervous energy. The road to town wound through pine forest before dropping into a wide valley where the settlement of Stillwater crouched against the mountains. It was a mining town trying to pretend it was more. A main street lined with false front buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, houses scattered on the hillsides like dice thrown by careless hands. The mine itself sat northeast of town, a gash in the mountain with enormous slag heaps, and a creek running black from its mouth. They arrived at 8:40, and already the courthouse steps were crowded. Word had spread. Caleb saw the faces turn as they approached, some curious, some hostile, some carefully neutral. A man in a suit and badge stepped forward. Sheriff Doyle, Caleb guessed, from Eli's description. Older, heavy-set, with eyes that had learned not to see certain things. "Mrs. Carter, you're early." "I'm on time, Sheriff." "Judge asked me to convey his offer one more time. You sign over the property peacefully, we'll arrange a placement for Eli in town instead of Helena. You'd be able to visit regular." "No." Mara's voice was steady. "We're going to trial." The sheriff's gaze slid to Caleb, assessing, dismissing. "Who's this?" "A friend." "Didn't know you had friends, Mara." "Learn something new every day, Sheriff." She climbed down from the wagon, Eli jumping after her. Caleb followed, the wrapped samples in his arms, the journal tucked in his coat. They walked up the courthouse steps through a corridor of stairs. Inside, the courtroom was small and stuffy, with wooden benches and a raised platform where Judge Henley presided. He was a big man gone to fat, with mutton chop whiskers and eyes like chips of slate. When he saw Mara enter with Caleb and the mysterious bundle, his expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "Mrs. Carter, please be seated." They took the front bench. Across the aisle sat a thin man in spectacles, the county prosecutor, and behind him, scattered through the gallery, Caleb recognized the type: mine supervisors, town councilmen, landowners with interest to protect, the kind of men who made sure certain questions didn't get asked. Judge Henley banged his gavel. "This is a hearing to determine the custodial fitness of Mrs. Mara Carter, widow, regarding her minor son Eli Carter, age 8. The court has received a petition from concerned citizens alleging that Mrs. Carter cannot provide adequate care and that the child would be better served by placement in territorial care. Mrs. Carter, do you have representation?" "No, Your Honor. I'll speak for myself." "Very well, Prosecutor Davis. Present your evidence." What followed was a systematic dismantling of Mara Carter's life. The prosecutor called the tax assessor, who testified the property was 3 months delinquent. The schoolteacher, who said Eli had missed 12 days last semester. A neighbor, though Caleb noted the man wouldn't meet Mara's eyes, who claimed the ranch was in dangerous disrepair and unsuitable for a child. Mara sat rigid through it all, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white. Eli pressed against her side. Caleb watched the gallery, saw the careful avoidance of eye contact, the shame poorly hidden. These weren't evil people. They were frightened people, protecting their own interests and telling themselves it was necessary. When the prosecutor finished, Judge Henley turned to Mara. "Mrs. Carter, do you wish to respond?" She stood, and Caleb saw her gathering herself, pulling up every ounce of strength she had left. "Your Honor, everything they've said about the ranch is true. It is behind on taxes. It does need repairs. Eli has missed school. But none of that is because I'm unfit. It's because my husband died after working in that mine." She pointed north toward the wound in the mountain. "And the water that mine produces poisoned our land, poisoned our livestock, poisoned him." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Judge Henley's eyes went hard. "Mrs. Carter, this is a custody hearing, not a referendum on local industry." "It's both, Your Honor, because the reason I'm here is because I asked questions about that mine. Because my husband documented what it was doing. Because the men who profit from it want my silence, and they'll take my son to get it." "That's a serious accusation." "Yes, it is." Mara reached back and Caleb handed her the journal. She held it up for the courtroom to see. "This is my husband's documentation. 18 months of observations. Names of sick miners. Chemical analysis he had done. And this..." Caleb passed her one of the jars, and she set it on the prosecutor's table with a thunk that echoed, "Is water from our well, sealed and buried by my husband before he died. Physical evidence that something is very, very wrong." The courtroom erupted. Judge Henley banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order, Mrs. Carter. This is highly irregular. Evidence must be submitted through proper channels that you control." Mara's voice cut through the noise, clear and strong. "Channels that conveniently lose paperwork and delay investigations? My husband tried proper channels. He's dead. So I'm standing here in front of witnesses presenting evidence that you can't make disappear." Caleb stood then, adding his physical presence to her words. He set the remaining jars on the table, lined them up like soldiers. The cloudy, tainted water spoke louder than any testimony. Judge Henley's face had gone red. "Sheriff, remove this man." But Sheriff Doyle didn't move. He was staring at the jars, and something in his expression had shifted. "Your Honor, maybe we should look at—" "Sheriff, I gave you an order. Tom Carter was a good man." The voice came from the back of the gallery. An old man stood, weathered and bent, wearing the scars of decades in the mines. "He worked beside me for 5 years. When he got sick, I got sick too. Lost half a lung to the mine doctor's knife. Tom said the water was bad. Said the runoff was poison. He was going to prove it, but then he died, and I kept my mouth shut because I got grandchildren to feed, and the mine's the only work there is." Another voice, a woman this time. "My Billy died last spring, lung fever," the doctor said. "Same as Thomas Carter, same as 6 other men in the past 2 years. All of them worked the mine." The courtroom was unraveling, becoming something Judge Henley couldn't control. More voices rose, sharing stories of sickness and death, of questions answered with threats, of a community that had swallowed its doubts because the alternative was starving. Caleb watched it happen, saw the moment when fear turned to anger, when silence broke into speech. This was what Thomas Carter had died for. Not justice from a courthouse, but truth spoken in the light. Judge Henley slammed his gavel down. "This hearing is adjourned. Everyone out. Now." But no one moved. "The mine kills people," Mara said quietly into the echoing silence. "You all know it. You've known it for years. And you've let it keep killing because it was easier than fighting. Well, I'm done being easy. I'm done being quiet. You want to take my son? You'll have to explain to everyone in this room why a mother who demands answers about poison is less fit than a judge who profits from it." Judge Henley stood, his chair scraping loudly. "Mrs. Carter, you are in contempt of—" "Sam." The voice was female, calm, and came from the side door where a woman in a severe black dress had entered. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone used to authority. Caleb didn't recognize her, but clearly everyone else did. The room fell silent. "Dr. Abernathy," Judge Henley said stiffly, "this is a closed hearing." "No, it isn't. Not anymore." She walked to the front of the room, opened a leather satchel, and withdrew a ledger. "I am the county medical examiner. For the past 3 years, I have documented every death in this district. I have also documented the cause of death as reported to me by the mine physician, Dr. Talbot, who is compensated by the mining company. The pattern is concerning." She opened the ledger and read, "Thomas Carter, age 34, cause of death, pneumonia. William Mackenzie, age 41, cause of death, consumption. Robert Chen, age 29, cause of death, lung fever." She looked up. 15 deaths in 36 months, all men between 25 and 50, all presenting with respiratory failure. The statistical probability of this being coincidental is less than 1%. Judge Henley's face had gone from red to pale. "Dr. Abernathy, your professional opinion has no bearing on a custody matter." "It does when the custody matter is predicated on unfitness caused by poverty resulting from a husband's death that should never have occurred." She turned to face the gallery. "I kept silent because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my position, my home, my standing. But I am also a physician, and I took an oath. These men deserve better. This woman deserves better. And I will not be party to silencing her for having the courage I lacked." Caleb felt the shift in the room, the way power transferred from the bench to the people. Judge Henley felt it too. He gathered his papers with shaking hands. "This hearing is continued pending review of new evidence. Mrs. Carter retains custody of her son until such time as—" "No." Mara's voice was quiet but absolute. "Dismiss it. Dismiss it now in front of witnesses, or I take this journal and these samples directly to the territorial marshal in Helena, along with Dr. Abernathy's testimony, and we'll see what a federal investigation turns up about the finances of local judges." It was checkmate, and they all knew it. Judge Henley stared at Mara Carter, this woman he'd tried to crush, and saw someone who'd learned to fight in the only way that mattered, by refusing to disappear quietly. "Petition dismissed," he said through clenched teeth. "Case closed. Sheriff, clear the courtroom." But before anyone could move, the old miner spoke again. What about the mine? What about the men still working there? Dr. Abernathy answered, I'll be filing a report with territorial health authorities today. A full investigation will be required. And in the meantime, someone else called, we supposed to keep drinking poison water and dying slow. The questions came faster, voices overlapping, anger breaking through years of careful suppression. Judge Henley fled the bench, disappearing through his chamber's door. The sheriff stood helpless as the courtroom transformed into a town meeting, people demanding answers, sharing stories, finding solidarity in shared grief. Caleb touched Mara's shoulder. We should go. She nodded, gathering Eli close. They slipped out through the side door while the courthouse roiled with raised voices. Outside, the morning sun had burned off the chill, and the street was filling with people who'd heard the commotion and come running. They made it to the wagon before someone called Mara's name. She turned to find 3 women approaching. The schoolteacher who'd testified against her, another woman Caleb didn't recognize, and a younger girl carrying a baby. Mrs. Carter, the schoolteacher said, and her voice was thick with shame. What I said in there, they told me I had to, said the school would lose funding if I didn't cooperate, and I thought it wouldn't matter, that you'd just sign the papers and leave quiet. Well, Mara said evenly, I didn't. No, you didn't. The woman's eyes glistened. My husband works the mine. He's been coughing blood for 3 months, and the mine doctor keeps saying it's nothing, but it's not nothing, is it? No, Mara said softly. It's not nothing. The younger woman with the baby stepped forward. My sister's boy died last year. They said he drank bad water, that it was our fault for not boiling it proper. But we always boiled it, always. And he died anyway, and they made us feel like it was our failing, like we weren't fit mothers. Mara's expression cracked, just for a moment, showing the raw grief beneath. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. The schoolteacher reached out and gripped Mara's hand. Be angry, stay angry, and keep fighting, because you just showed us it's possible. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the enormity of what had happened settling over them like snow. Eli dozed against his mother's shoulder, exhausted by fear and relief. Caleb drove the wagon, giving Mara space to process. It wasn't until they were back in the yard, unhitching Samson, that she finally spoke. They'll come for me another way. Judge Henley, the mine owners, they won't just let this go. No, Caleb agreed. They won't. So what do I do? He looked at her, this woman who'd stood in a courtroom and refused to be erased, and told her the truth. You keep standing, every day, until they realize it's easier to let you stand than to keep pushing you down. And if they don't realize that, then you fight, and you make sure you're not fighting alone. Mara studied him, and he saw her calculating again, reassessing. You've done this before, fought powerful people, lost people you cared about to them. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't confirm or deny. He just finished with the harness and started toward the barn. Mr. Drummond, her voice stopped him. I know you said 1 week, but if you're willing to stay longer, I could use the help, not just with the ranch, with what comes next. Caleb felt the familiar weight, the pull of other people's fights becoming his own. He'd spent years running from that weight, telling himself he was better alone. But standing in this yard, looking at this woman who'd just ripped hope from the jaws of despair, he couldn't remember why being alone had seemed so important. I'll stay, he said quietly. As long as you need. Relief flooded her face, followed immediately by suspicion. Why? Does it matter? I asked you that before. You never answered. Caleb thought about the men he'd failed, the fights he'd walked away from, the slow accumulation of regret that had driven him into the mountains. He thought about the boy with bleeding feet who'd grabbed his reins and asked for help. He thought about how easy it would have been to ride away and how small that easiness made him feel. Maybe I'm tired of running, he said. Mara nodded slowly. Then welcome to standing still, Mr. Drummond. It's harder, but the view's better. Eli burst from the cabin, chores forgotten in his excitement. Mama, can I show Mr. Caleb the creek? The good part where the trout hide? Mara smiled, a real smile that took years off her face. After you bring in firewood and feed the chickens. Yes, ma'am. He raced off, all boy energy and joy. They stood together in the afternoon light, watching him run, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a locked door opening on a room he'd thought sealed forever. This ranch, these people, this fight, maybe it wasn't his, but maybe it could be. "One day at a time," Mara said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "That's how we do it. One day at a time until the days add up to something worth keeping." Caleb nodded. One day at a time. He could manage that. For the first time in years, one day at a time felt like enough. The first sign of trouble came 3 nights later when Caleb woke to the smell of smoke. He was out of the barn loft before his eyes were fully open, rifle in hand, boots half-laced. The yard was silver with moonlight, and at first he saw nothing. Then the wind shifted and he caught it again. Not wood smoke from a chimney, but something sharper, chemical. Wrong. He ran toward the smell, past the chicken coop and the garden plot, following his nose to the north fence line. There, smoldering in the grass, he found a pile of oiled rags that had been set alight and kicked apart before they could spread. Boot prints led away toward the road, 2 sets, the same ones he'd seen surveying the property that first day. Caleb stamped out the remaining embers and stood in the dark, listening. The night was quiet except for wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. Whoever had set the fire was long gone, but the message was clear. The courthouse victory had only made Mara Carter a bigger problem, and problems had ways of disappearing. He carried the scorched rags back to the barn, locked them in the tack room, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn came gray and cold, he was already walking the property perimeter, looking for weaknesses. The fence line was too long to defend alone. The cabin sat exposed on its little rise, visible from 3 directions. The barn offered some cover, but its aging walls wouldn't stop a determined man with a torch. Mara found him at the well, checking the water level and the integrity of the stone lining. She carried 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the chill air. "You're up early," she said, handing him a cup. "So are you." Couldn't sleep. She studied his face, reading something in his expression. "What happened?" Caleb told her about the fire, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hand tighten on the cup until her knuckles went white. But she didn't cry, didn't panic. She just nodded slowly like she'd been expecting this. "How long until they try again?" "Hard to say. Could be tonight, could be next week. Depends on how desperate they are. Judge Henley left town yesterday. Sheriff Doyle told me when I went in for supplies, said the judge took an extended leave to visit family in Denver." "Running scared," Caleb said. "But that doesn't mean he's harmless. Scared men make dangerous choices." Mara sipped her coffee, staring out at the land her husband had died protecting. The morning sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge, painting the hay meadow gold. "Thomas used to say this place was worth fighting for. I never understood what he meant until I thought I might lose it. It's not the land itself, it's what it represents. The idea that a person can build something, make something better, leave something behind that matters." "Your husband was a good man." "He was." Her voice went soft. "But he was also stubborn and idealistic, and it got him killed. I'm not sure I want to follow his example quite that far." "You won't have to." Caleb set down his cup. "Because you're not fighting alone this time." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the question she was too afraid to ask. "Who are you, and why are you still here?" But instead of pressing, she just nodded. "I'm taking Eli to town today. School's back in session, and he's missed enough already. Will you be all right here alone?" "I'll manage." "But Mrs. Carter—" He waited until she met his eyes. "Keep your rifle with you, and if anyone approaches you in town, anyone who makes you uncomfortable, you get to the sheriff's office. Doyle may be compromised, but he won't let harm come to you in broad daylight." "You think they'd try something in town?" "I think they're deciding what kind of problem you are and what it'll cost to solve you. Until they make that calculation, assume the worst." Fear flickered across her face, quickly suppressed. "I'm starting to understand why you know so much about this." Caleb didn't respond. After a moment, Mara collected the cups and headed back to the cabin. Through the window, he watched her wake Eli, watched them move through the morning routine of breakfast and washing up, watched her check the rifle before wrapping it in a blanket and placing it under the wagon seat. They left at 8, Mara driving the wagon with Eli beside her, the boy chattering about arithmetic and whether he'd have to make up all the work he'd missed. Caleb watched until they disappeared around the bend, then set to work. He spent the morning reinforcing what could be reinforced, nailed loose boards on the barn, cleared brush from around the buildings to create a fire break, checked every water barrel and bucket. He moved the horses to the far pasture where they'd be harder to spook or harm. He cached supplies in 3 different locations: food, ammunition, medical supplies, in case he had to abandon the main buildings. By noon, he'd done everything he could think of. The ranch wouldn't survive a determined assault, but it might survive a warning shot, and right now that was the best he could hope for. He was mending fence when he heard the rider coming up the road. Single horse, moving at an easy walk, not someone trying to surprise him. Caleb set down the wire and positioned himself where he had a clear view and room to move. His hand didn't go to his rifle, but it didn't move far from it either. The rider was a man in his 60s, lean and weathered, sitting his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. He wore work clothes and a battered hat, and when he saw Caleb, he raised one hand in greeting. "You'd be Drummond." "I would." "Name's Otto Fisher, got the smithy in town." The man dismounted, moved slow and careful. "Came to talk, if you've got a minute." Caleb recognized the name from the courthouse, the old miner who'd spoken up about working with Thomas Carter. He nodded toward the cabin. "Coffee's on the stove." They walked together across the yard. Otto moved with the stiff gait of a man whose joints hurt, but who'd learned to live with it. Inside, Caleb poured 2 cups, and they sat at the table, the afternoon light slanting through the windows. "I'll be direct," Otto said. "There's folks in town who appreciated what Mrs. Carter did in that courtroom, what you helped her do. We've been swallowing our doubts for too long, and seeing her stand up like that, it reminded us what spine looks like." "That's good to hear." "But there's also folks who didn't appreciate it, and those folks got money and influence and a strong interest in making sure the mine investigation goes away quiet." Otto sipped his coffee, his eyes sharp and steady. "I hear things, working the smithy. People talk while they're waiting on repairs. Yesterday I heard 2 of the mine foremen discussing how the Carter problem might be resolved. They weren't subtle about it." Caleb's jaw tightened. "What did they say?" "That accidents happen on remote ranches, fires start, wells get poisoned, widows get discouraged and leave. One of them laughed and said Judge Henley might be gone, but the deputy's still loyal, and loyalty can be useful." Otto set down his cup. "I rode out here to tell you to watch yourself. And to let you know you've got friends. Not enough of us, maybe, but we're there." "How many?" "Hard to say. A dozen who'd speak up public. Maybe twice that who'd help quiet. We're organizing, forming a sort of citizens committee. Dr. Abernathy's leading it. She's got connections with the territorial authorities, and she's pushing for a full investigation. Not just the mine, but the finances around it. Who's profiting, who's been paid off, the whole ugly mess." Caleb absorbed this, fitting pieces together. The mine owners won't let that happen without a fight. No, they won't. Which is why we need to be smart. Mrs. Carter's become a symbol. If something happens to her now, it proves everything she said was true, makes her a martyr. That's bad for business, and worse for political cover. Otto leaned forward. "But symbols can be protected. You keep her safe, we'll keep the pressure up in town. Between us, maybe we can hold the line until the territorial marshal arrives." "When's that supposed to happen?" "Dr. Abernathy sent the request 3 days ago. Could be 2 weeks, could be 2 months. Government moves slow." He stood, leaving his coffee half finished. "I should get back before I'm missed. But Drummond, if you need help, you send word. We're not soldiers, but we're not cowards either. Not anymore." Caleb walked him to his horse. Before mounting, Otto turned back. "One more thing. There's a man named Garrett Cole. Works for the mine as head of security. Ex-army, mean as a snake, loyal only to his pay. If someone's coming for Mrs. Carter, it'll be him or men he hires. He's got a scar across his left cheek, and he's missing 2 fingers on his right hand. You see him anywhere near this property, don't wait to ask questions." "Understood." Otto swung into the saddle with a grunt. "Thomas Carter was my friend. I owed him better than silence. I'm trying to pay that debt now, even if it's too late to matter to him. It matters to his family." "Yeah." Otto looked toward the cabin, his expression heavy with regret. "Yeah, I suppose it does." He rode away, and Caleb stood in the yard watching dust settle on the road. The afternoon stretched quiet and tense, full of waiting. He went back to the fence, worked until his hands ached and the sun angled low. When he heard the wagon returning, he was relieved in a way that surprised him. Mara pulled into the yard looking exhausted. Eli jumped down, carrying a slate and a bundle of books, chattering about his lessons. Mara climbed down slower, and Caleb saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the property before she fully relaxed. "Any trouble?" he asked quietly. "Not exactly, but people stared. Some looked angry, some looked scared. Mrs. Henderson from the general store told me I'd made things difficult for everyone, that I should have kept my mouth shut and left." She paused. Then she gave me a 20-pound bag of flour and said it was on account, wouldn't take payment. People are complicated. I'm learning that. She started unhitching Samson, her movements automatic. "How is it here?" Caleb told her about Otto's visit, about the Citizens Committee, and the warnings about Garrett Cole. He watched her process the information, saw her making the same calculations he'd made earlier about fire breaks and defensible positions, and how long they could hold out if it came to that. "Maybe I should send Eli away," she said quietly. "My sister's in Oregon. She'd take him until this is settled." "Would he go?" Mara smiled, bitter and proud. "Not willingly. He's his father's son, stubborn and loyal and too brave for his own good. Then we keep him close. Safer to know where he is than to worry about him on the road." Caleb finished with the harness and gave Samson a pat. "Besides, running teaches the wrong lesson. Sometimes the right thing is to stand and face what's coming. Even if what's coming might kill you. Especially then." They stood in the gathering dusk, the first stars appearing overhead, and Caleb felt the weight of what he'd committed to settling into his bones. This wasn't his land or his fight, but it was becoming his responsibility, and that was almost the same thing. Over supper, venison stew again, stretched with more potatoes and less meat, Eli told them about school, how the teacher had made him stand and tell the class about the courthouse, how some kids had called him a hero and others had whispered that his mama was a troublemaker, how he'd gotten in a fight with Billy Henderson, the storekeeper's son, and they'd both been kept in during lunch. "Fighting solves nothing, Eli," Mara said, but her tone was mild. "Billy said you were a liar, said the mine never hurt nobody, and you were just trying to steal money." Eli's jaw set in a way that reminded Caleb of Mara in the courtroom. "I told him his mama knew the truth. That's why she gave us the flour. Then he pushed me, so I pushed back." Caleb hid a smile. Mara sighed. "What am I going to do with you?" "Love me anyway?" Eli suggested hopefully. "Always." She ruffled his hair. "But no more fighting. We defend ourselves with truth, not fists." "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" The question hung in the air, heavy with all the things a child knew but couldn't articulate. Mara reached across the table and took her son's hand. "Yes, we're going to be okay. Promise?" "I promise." It was the kind of promise no one could really make, the kind that depended on luck and strength and the kindness of strangers. But Eli needed to hear it, so Mara said it with conviction, and Caleb saw the boy relax, choosing to believe because the alternative was too frightening. After Eli was asleep, Mara and Caleb sat on the porch in the dark. The night was cool, full of cricket song and the smell of pine. Mara wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stared out at the land she'd fought to keep. "I lied to him," she said quietly. "I don't know if we'll be okay. I don't know if promises mean anything when powerful men want you gone." "They mean something to the person hearing them," Caleb said. "Sometimes that's enough." "You really believe that?" "I have to." She looked at him sideways, and in the moonlight her face was pale and thoughtful. "You've lost people. I can see it in the way you move, the way you watch the shadows." "Who were they?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. He'd spent years not answering that question, not even asking it of himself. But sitting here in the dark with this woman who'd trusted him with her son's safety, silence felt like cowardice. "I had a family," he said finally. "Wife, daughter. We homesteaded in Kansas back before the war. I was young and stupid and thought hard work was enough to make things right. He paused, the words like gravel in his throat. But the land was claimed by a cattle outfit that had friends in the territorial government. They wanted us gone. Made that clear in a dozen ways: cut fences, poisoned wells, threats. I thought if I kept my head down, if I didn't make trouble, they'd leave us alone. They didn't. No. One night they came with torches, set fire to the cabin while we slept. I got out, grabbed my rifle and ran after them, thinking I could stop them, make them pay. His hands clenched on the porch rail. When I came back, the cabin was ashes. My wife had gotten our daughter out, but the smoke. They died 2 days later. The doctor said their lungs were burned too bad to save. Mara's breath caught. Caleb. I hunted the men who did it, found 3 of them, killed 2. The 3rd got away, turned me into the law. I ran before they could hang me, been running ever since. He looked at her, his eyes hollow. That's who I am, Mrs. Carter. A failed husband, a failed father, and a wanted man who's been too much of a coward to stand still. And yet you're here. And yet I'm here. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and warm against his. I'm sorry for what you lost. Sorry for the pain you've carried. But Caleb, running away from that didn't make you a coward. It made you someone who survived, and choosing to stop running, to help us, that doesn't erase the past, but it honors the man you're trying to become. Her words hit him like a physical blow, breaking something open in his chest that he'd kept locked for years. He wanted to pull away, to reject the absolution she was offering, because he didn't deserve it. But her grip was firm, and her eyes held his with an understanding that came from her own grief. I can't promise I'll be enough, he said. Can't promise I'll keep you safe. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking you to try. That's all any of us can do. They sat together in the dark, hands clasped, while the night deepened around them. And for the first time since Kansas, Caleb felt the possibility that maybe he could be more than his failures. Maybe he could be enough. The next week passed in tense normalcy. Caleb worked the ranch, repairing what could be repaired and improving what couldn't. He fixed the barn's lean, shored up the chicken coop, and started on the fence line with proper posts and tensioned wire. Mara worked beside him when she could, her hands blistering and then hardening as she learned to handle tools she'd never had time to master when Thomas was alive. Eli went to school each day, coming home with stories of shifting alliances and playground politics that mirrored the adult tensions in town. Some families had started treating the Carters with respect, sending small gifts, a jar of preserves, a few eggs, a sack of oats for the horses. Others crossed the street to avoid Mara when she came to town, their faces tight with fear or anger or shame. Otto Fisher visited twice more, bringing news of the Citizens Committee's progress. Dr. Abernathy had compiled a report documenting every suspicious death in the past 5 years, cross-referenced with mine employment records. The pattern was damning. Miners and their families died at 3 times the rate of other residents, almost always from respiratory failure. She'd sent the report to Helena, along with Thomas Carter's journal and water samples, demanding immediate investigation. The territorial marshal had responded with a letter saying he'd assigned someone to review the matter within 60 days. 60 days. 2 months of waiting, of watching shadows, of sleeping with one ear open. 2 months for the mine owners to decide whether silencing the Carters was worth the risk. On the 8th day after the courthouse hearing, Caleb was replacing a rotted section of the porch when he saw the riders coming up the road. 3 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace that said they had business and didn't care who knew it. He set down his hammer and called toward the cabin. Mara, company. She appeared in the doorway, Eli behind her. Caleb positioned himself on the porch steps, not blocking the way, but making it clear visitors would have to go through him. His rifle leaned against the cabin wall, close enough to grab. The lead rider was a big man with a scarred face and a right hand missing 2 fingers. Garrett Cole. The mine's security chief rode like he owned the road, his eyes taking in the ranch with the careful assessment of someone mapping weaknesses. The 2 men behind him were younger, harder, the kind hired for muscle rather than brains. Cole reined in 10 feet from the porch and tipped his hat to Mara. Mrs. Carter, beautiful afternoon. Mr. Cole, this is private property. I'm aware. Just came by to deliver a message from the mine ownership. They wanted to extend their apologies for any misunderstanding regarding the water quality issues. His voice was smooth, practiced. Turns out there was a technical malfunction in the drainage system that's since been corrected. The mine superintendent wanted to make sure you knew they take environmental concerns seriously. How considerate, Mara said, her tone flat. They also wanted to make a gesture of goodwill. Cole reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an envelope. $500. Compensation for your husband's illness and your trouble. All you need to do is sign a paper saying the matter's settled and you won't pursue further action. He held out the envelope like it was salvation. Mara didn't move to take it. And if I don't sign? Cole's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, that'd be unfortunate. See, the mine's planning to expand operations. Bought up most of the land around here except for your plot. If you won't sell, they'll have to route the new drainage around your property. Might impact your water quality even more. Might make the land worthless. He paused. Of course, if you signed the settlement, they could include your land in the sale at a fair price. You could relocate somewhere healthier. Give your boy a fresh start. Caleb watched the play unfold, recognizing it for what it was. A threat dressed up as an offer, delivered with just enough deniability that Cole could claim innocent intentions. The two hired guns sat their horses with bored expressions, but their hands stayed near their weapons. The answer's no, Mara said. Tell your employers I'm not interested in their money or their apologies. Tell them I'm waiting for the territorial marshal's investigation, and I'll cooperate fully with whatever he requires. Cole's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Carter. A woman alone with a child, way out here, accidents happen. Would hate to see something unfortunate befall you. Caleb moved then, just a single step forward, but it was enough to shift the dynamic. His voice came out quiet, cold. She's not alone. And if accidents start happening, I'll make sure they happen to the right people. Cole's eyes shifted to Caleb, really seeing him for the first time. Something passed across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the assessment of one dangerous man measuring another. You're Drummond, the drifter. Cole's tone suggested he knew more than that. Heard you've been playing ranch hand. Didn't figure you for the type to settle down. Didn't figure I was either. Turns out I was wrong. The two men stared at each other, and Caleb felt the calculation happening behind Cole's eyes. Was removing Drummond worth the risk? What would it cost? What would it prove? Mrs. Carter, you've got 1 week to reconsider, Cole said, still looking at Caleb. After that, the offer's withdrawn, and you'll have to live with the consequences of your choices. He wheeled his horse and rode away, his men following. They didn't hurry, didn't look back, just rode down the road like they had all the time in the world. Caleb watched until they disappeared, then turned to find Mara pale and shaking. That was a threat. Yes. He knows about you, about Kansas. Caleb had figured as much. Cole had the look of someone who made it his business to know things, to collect information and use it. Probably. Will he tell the law? Depends on whether turning me in serves his interests. Right now, I'd say no. Having me arrested would make you more sympathetic, draw more attention. Better for them if I just disappear quietly. Mara wrapped her arms around herself. This is getting worse. Maybe I should take his offer. $500 would let us start over somewhere safe. Would it? Caleb turned to face her. You think they'd let you leave with that money and Thomas's evidence? You think they'd risk you talking to newspapers in Oregon or California? You sign that paper, you're admitting defeat, and defeated enemies don't need to be silenced. The implications hung between them, ugly and undeniable. Eli had been listening from the doorway, and now he came out, his young face tight with fear. Are they going to kill us, Mama? Mara pulled him close, her eyes fierce. No, they're not, because we're not going to give them reason to. We're going to be smart and careful, and we're going to outlast them. How? By doing exactly what we've been doing, living our lives, working the ranch, waiting for the marshal, showing everyone in town that we're not afraid. She looked at Caleb. Right? He wanted to tell her it was more complicated than that survival often came down to luck as much as courage. But Eli was watching him with eyes that needed hope, and Mara was holding herself together through sheer will, and sometimes the truth mattered less than what people needed to believe. Right, he said. We keep going. But we stay alert and we don't take chances. That night, Caleb didn't sleep in the barn. He made a bedroll on the cabin floor, positioned where he could see both the door and the window. Mara didn't argue, just brought him a pillow and a quilt and said thank you. Eli fell asleep quickly, the resilience of childhood letting him find peace despite the day's fears. Mara sat up later, mending clothes by lamplight, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Around midnight, she finally spoke. I'm scared. I know. Not just for me, for Eli, for you, for all the people in town who stuck their necks out because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. You did the right thing. Did I? She set down her sewing. Thomas died doing the right thing. If I get killed, if Eli gets hurt, will it still be right? Or will it just be stupid and stubborn and pointless? Caleb sat up, the quilt falling away. Listen to me. Your husband documented crimes that were killing people. You exposed those crimes when everyone else was too scared. That's not pointless. That's the only thing that gives those deaths meaning. But if we die too soon, we won't. He said it with a certainty he didn't feel. Because we're ready for them now. Because we've got allies. Because sometimes the people who stand up are the ones who survive, precisely because they refuse to lie down. Mara wiped her eyes, nodded, and went back to her sewing. But Caleb saw her hands shaking, saw the tears she wouldn't let fall, and he understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was being terrified and continuing anyway. The week crawled past. Caleb split his time between ranch work and defensive preparations. He taught Eli how to recognize the sound of riders approaching, how to run to the root cellar and bar the door from inside if trouble came. He showed Mara how to load and fire the rifle quickly, how to aim for center mass rather than trying for headshots. They practiced until her hands stopped shaking when she pulled the trigger. Otto Fisher came by twice more, always careful to arrive in daylight and leave before dusk. He brought news that the Citizens Committee had grown to 23 members, that Dr. Abernathy had received acknowledgement from Helena that an investigator would arrive within the month, that the mine had started laying off workers and blaming the Carter lawsuit for their financial troubles. They're trying to turn the town against you, Otto said on his second visit, saying you're destroying livelihoods, that the mine's shutting down because of your troublemaking. Is it working? Mara asked. With some folks, yes, but others remember their dead husbands and sons. Others see their own sickness getting worse. The mine's been bleeding this town dry for years. You just made people notice the blood. He paused. There's talk of a town meeting next week. The mine owners are demanding a chance to present their side. Dr. Abernathy thinks we should attend, make our case public again. That's a risk, Caleb said. Could be a trap. Could be. But hiding makes us look guilty, makes it easier for them to control the narrative. Otto looked at Mara. Your call, Mrs. Carter. But I think we need to show we're not afraid. Mara glanced at Caleb, and he saw her weighing options, calculating odds. Finally, she nodded. We'll go. But we go together, and we leave before dark. Fair enough. Otto stood to leave, then hesitated. One more thing. Garrett Cole's been hiring. Brought in 4 new men from out of territory, the kind who work for cash and don't ask questions. Could be just for mine security, but probably not, Caleb finished. Yeah, watch yourselves. After Otto left, Caleb walked the fence line again, looking for signs of intrusion. He found them at the north corner, fresh tracks, boot prints circling the property just beyond the boundary. Someone was watching, mapping, waiting. That night, he heard horses in the distance around 2 a.m. He was outside with his rifle before they came close enough to see, positioned behind the water trough with a clear field of fire. The riders, 2 of them, passed on the road without stopping, but slow enough to make it clear they wanted to be heard. Psychological warfare, making sure the Carters knew they were being watched, wearing them down with anticipation. Caleb didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, he found Mara already awake, standing at the window with Thomas's rifle in her hands. They rode by again an hour ago, she said quietly. Same 2 horses. They're not even trying to hide it. They don't need to. They want you scared. It's working. She turned to face him, and in the gray morning light she looked older, harder. But I'm also angry, and I'm starting to think anger might be more useful than fear. It is. But you've got to control it, channel it. Angry people make mistakes. Then teach me not to make mistakes, Caleb. Teach me how to fight like you do, cold and careful and certain. He looked at her, this widow who'd been pushed to her breaking point and found steel instead of surrender, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction exactly, though there was some of that. It was respect, recognition, the acknowledgement that she was becoming the kind of person who could survive this, who could win. All right, he said. Let's start with the basics. First rule, never fight fair. Fair fights are for fools and dead men. You fight to win, whatever it takes. They spent the morning running drills. How to move through the cabin if someone broke in. How to create choke points and kill zones. How to use the environment, furniture, walls, darkness, as weapons. Eli watched from the loft, absorbing lessons no 8-year-old should need. By noon, they were all exhausted. Mara made lunch, bread and cheese and the last of the venison, and they ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. I've been thinking, Mara said finally, about the town meeting, about what we should say. And? We should bring people, the ones the mine hurt, the widows, the sick miners, the families who lost children. Let them tell their stories. Make it real, not abstract. She looked at Caleb. Would that work? Or would it just make things worse? It might do both, he admitted, but if you're going to fight, fight with everything you've got. Make them see the cost of their greed. Then that's what we'll do. She stood, squared her shoulders. I'll ride to town tomorrow, start making arrangements. Will you come with me? Wouldn't let you go alone. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the sky that impossible blue that made promises about the day ahead. They rode to Stillwater together, Eli staying behind with strict instructions to hide if anyone approached. Caleb hated leaving the boy alone, but bringing him seemed worse. Too many variables, too many ways for things to go wrong. Town was quiet when they arrived, the streets mostly empty in the mid-morning lull. Mara went first to Dr. Abernathy's office, while Caleb stood watch outside, his eyes tracking every person who passed. The doctor's response was immediate. Yes, she'd help organize testimony. Yes, she'd bring her medical records. Yes, she believed this was the right strategy. From there, they visited Otto at the smithy. He was working a piece of iron on his anvil, the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal echoing through the space. When he saw them, he set down his tools and wiped his hands. Figured I'd see you soon. Word spreading about the town meeting. Mine owners are promising jobs if the investigation gets dropped, threatening layoffs if it doesn't. How many people will stand with us? Mara asked. Otto considered. Hard to say. In private, maybe 20, 30 families. In public, in front of the mine bosses and their hired guns? He shrugged. We'll find out. They spent the next 2 hours visiting homes, talking to widows and sick miners, listening to stories of loss and fear. Some people agreed immediately to speak at the meeting. Others wanted to but were too afraid. One woman, Mrs. Chen, whose husband had died the year before, actually spat at Mara's feet. You've made everything worse, she hissed. Now there's no work, and no compensation, and my children are starving. I hope you're satisfied. Mara absorbed the words like blows but didn't respond. Caleb watched her hold herself together, refusing to break even when everything in her must have wanted to scream back. When they left Mrs. Chen's house, Mara's hands were shaking. She's right. I made it worse. No, Caleb said firmly. The mine made it worse. They poisoned the water, killed the workers, and now they're using poverty as a weapon. That's not on you. But if I'd stayed quiet, people would still be dying. They'd just be dying in silence. He caught her arm, made her look at him. You didn't create this situation, Mara. You just stopped pretending it didn't exist. She nodded, but he could see the doubt eating at her. They continued their visits, collecting promises and witnessing fear, until the sun angled low and it was time to head back. They were almost to the wagon when Garrett Cole stepped out of the saloon, flanked by 2 of his hired men. He saw them and smiled, the expression cold and calculated. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Drummond, productive day. That's our business, Mara said. I'm making it mine. Cole walked closer, and Caleb's hand moved to his rifle. See, I've been doing some checking on your friend here. Turns out Caleb Drummond's a wanted man. Killed 2 people in Kansas back in '71. There's a warrant and a $500 reward. Mara went pale. Caleb kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing through options. Fight, run, talk their way out. None of them good. That warrant's old, Caleb said quietly, and Kansas is a long way from Montana. True, but the law's the law. Cole pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I could wire the authorities in Kansas, have a marshal here in a week. Or, he paused, letting the word hang. I could forget I ever heard the name Caleb Drummond. Depends on how cooperative Mrs. Carter feels about settling her dispute with the mine. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Caleb felt rage building in his chest, but forced it down. Anger wouldn't help. Only careful calculation would get them out of this. Mara's voice came out steady, cold. You turn in, Mr. Drummond. I'll make sure every newspaper between here and San Francisco knows the mine uses criminal threats to silence witnesses. I'll make you famous, Mr. Cole. Is that what you want? Cole's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected fear, surrender. Instead, he got defiance, and it threw him. You're bluffing. Try me. Mara stepped forward, and Caleb saw the woman she was becoming, someone who'd been pushed so far that consequences didn't matter anymore. Send your wire. Make your threats. But know that if you do, I'll burn your employer's reputation to the ground. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly how far they'll go to protect their profits. The standoff stretched, tense and fragile. Caleb watched Cole's hired men, saw them shifting their weight, hands near their guns. If this went wrong, if shooting started in the middle of town, people would die, probably including Mara. Think carefully, Cole, Caleb said, his voice low. You pull that trigger, you won't leave this street alive, and your bosses will lose more than money. They'll lose everything. Cole's eyes flicked between them, calculating odds. Finally, he stepped back. You've got until the town meeting. After that, all bets are off. He jerked his head at his men, and they walked away, disappearing into the saloon. Caleb and Mara stood frozen for a moment, adrenaline still coursing. Then Mara's knees buckled, and Caleb caught her, held her up while she shook. I thought he was going to shoot you, she whispered. He might still, but not today. They made it to the wagon, climbed in, and rode out of town in silence. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and red, and Caleb thought about how beautiful the world could be even when it was trying to kill you. When they reached the ranch, Eli ran out to meet them, relief flooding his face. Mara held him tight while Caleb unhitched the horses, and for a moment they were just a family coming home after a long day, normal and safe. But normalcy was an illusion, and safety was something they'd have to fight for. That night, Caleb told Mara the full truth about Kansas, not just the bare facts, but the details. How he'd tracked the men who killed his family. How the first one had begged before Caleb shot him. How the second had fought back and Caleb had beaten him to death with his bare hands. How the third had escaped and Caleb had spent years looking over his shoulder, waiting for the law to catch up. I'm not a good man, he said. I did terrible things, and I'd do them again if it meant protecting people I cared about. Mara listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. You're not the man you were in Kansas, she finally said. That man was destroyed by grief and rage. The man you are now is trying to build something instead of burning it down. That's what matters. Cole will use it against us. Let him. I meant what I said. I'll make them pay for every threat, every intimidation tactic. They want to fight. They'll get one. Looking at her face in the lamplight, Caleb believed her. She'd found her strength in the worst possible way, by losing everything and discovering she was still standing. Now she was dangerous, not because she was cruel, but because she'd stopped being afraid of consequences. They sat together until the lamp oil ran low, making plans for the town meeting, talking through scenarios and responses. When Mara finally went to bed, Caleb took up his position on the floor, rifle within reach. But sleep wouldn't come. He lay in the dark, listening to the sounds of the ranch, wind in the eaves, mice in the walls, the distant cry of a coyote. And beneath it all, the certainty that the worst was still coming, that Garrett Cole and his employers wouldn't let the town meeting happen without making one more play. Tomorrow, Caleb decided, he'd ride the perimeter and set tripwires, arrange signal fires, Create an early warning system. Tomorrow, he'd prepare for war. Tonight, he'd just keep watch, protecting the fragile peace of a woman and boy who'd given him something he thought he'd lost forever, a reason to stop running, a reason to stand and fight, whatever the cost. The fire came 2 nights before the town meeting. Caleb woke to the frantic barking of a dog he didn't know the Carters owned, then realized it was coming from Otto Fisher's place down the valley. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness through the window. At first he saw nothing but the familiar silhouettes of barn and fence line against the star-filled sky. Then the wind shifted and he smelled it, kerosene and smoke, sharp and acrid. He threw open the door just as orange light bloomed at the north fence line, flames racing along the dry grass where someone had poured accelerant in a careful line. The fire was moving fast, pushed by the night wind straight toward the hay meadow and the barn beyond. "Mara!" Caleb's shout was sharp and urgent. "Fire! Get Eli to the root cellar!" She appeared in her nightdress, hair loose, eyes wide with fear that turned instantly to action. She grabbed Eli from his bed and ran for the back door while Caleb sprinted toward the barn. The horses were already screaming, smelling smoke, their panic echoing across the yard. He threw open the stall doors and drove them out toward the east pasture, away from the flames, then grabbed every bucket and barrel he could carry. Mara met him at the well, already working the pump handle with furious speed. Water gushed into the first bucket and she thrust it at him, their hands touching briefly before he ran toward the flames. The fire had reached the meadow now, consuming the dry grass in great gulping waves. Caleb threw the water at the base of the flames, barely making a dent, and ran back for more. They fell into a desperate rhythm: pump, fill, run, throw, repeat. Eli emerged from the root cellar despite his mother's orders, dragging a smaller bucket, his face streaked with soot and tears. The 3 of them worked like machines, their world narrowing to water and fire and the terrible arithmetic of whether they could move fast enough to save what they'd built. Then Caleb saw the riders. 3 shapes on horseback, silhouetted against the flames, watching from the road. One of them raised a hand in what might have been a salute or a taunt. Then they wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness. Garrett Cole's men, making sure the message was delivered and understood. Rage flooded through Caleb, white-hot and consuming, but he forced it down. Chasing shadows wouldn't save the ranch. Only water and speed and luck would do that. The wind shifted again, pushing the fire back on itself, and suddenly they had a chance. Caleb redirected their efforts, creating a firebreak by soaking the ground between the flames and the barn. Mara worked beside him, her nightdress scorched and filthy, her hands raw from the pump handle. Eli ran supplies, wet sacks, shovels, anything that could be used to beat back the flames. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, the fire began to die. They'd lost the north fence line and a third of the hay meadow, but the barn still stood and the cabin was untouched. Caleb made one final circuit with a bucket, dousing hot spots, while Mara collapsed against the well, and Eli leaned into her side, both of them shaking with exhaustion and relief. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when Otto Fisher came riding up the road, 3 other men behind him. They carried shovels and axes and blankets, ready to fight, but the fight was already over. Otto took one look at the scorched earth and the soot-covered family, and his face went hard. "Cole's work?" 3 riders, Caleb confirmed, watched from the road to make sure it took. "Anyone hurt?" "Just the land." Mara's voice was rough from smoke. "We saved the barn." Otto dismounted and walked to the burned fence line, studying the pattern. Kerosene. Poured deliberate, meant to spread fast. This wasn't meant to kill you, it was meant to break you, make you too scared or too poor to keep fighting. "Well, it didn't work," Eli said, his young voice fierce despite the tremor in it. "We're still here." One of Otto's companions, a lean man named Jackson who worked part-time at the livery, spat into the ashes. "This is too far. Setting fire to a woman's property in the middle of the night, that's not business, that's terrorism." "It's also hard to prove," Otto said grimly. "No witnesses willing to testify. No physical evidence tying it to anyone specific. Cole's too smart to get his own hands dirty." "Then we make him get them dirty," Mara said. She stood, brushing off her ruined nightdress, and Caleb saw something new in her eyes. Not just anger, but cold calculation. The town meeting is in 2 days. We go. We bring everyone who's willing to speak, and we make sure the whole territory knows what happened here tonight." "That'll provoke them," Otto warned. "Good. Let them be provoked. Let them make mistakes." She looked at Caleb. "You said angry people make mistakes. Well, it works both ways. We make them angry enough, they'll slip up. Give us something we can use." Caleb studied her, recognizing the dangerous edge she was walking. Provoking violent men was a strategy, but it was also a gamble. Still, she was right that waiting passively for the next attack would only give Cole more opportunities. "All right," he said, "but we do it smart. We don't give them isolated targets or easy opportunities. From now until the meeting, we stay together, stay visible, and we make sure there are always witnesses." Otto nodded. "I'll spread the word. Anyone who wants to help can take shifts watching the ranch. We'll set up a rotation. Make sure you're never alone." The other men murmured agreement, and Caleb felt something shift. This was no longer just the Carters' fight. It was becoming something bigger, a line drawn between people who would tolerate injustice for the sake of peace and people who decided peace without justice wasn't worth having. They spent the rest of the morning cleaning up, hauling away charred fence posts and assessing the damage. The loss wasn't catastrophic, but it hurt. Winter feed destroyed, fencing materials they couldn't afford to replace, hours of work reduced to ash. Mara walked the burned section with Thomas's journal clutched to her chest, and Caleb understood she was measuring the cost of her husband's fight, wondering if the price was too high. Around noon, Dr. Abernathy arrived in a small buggy, her face tight with controlled fury. She'd brought medical supplies and food, practical help wrapped in dignified concern. While she checked Mara and Eli for injuries, minor burn, bursts, smoke inhalation, nothing serious, she told them what she'd learned. "I sent a telegram to the territorial marshal this morning, informing him of the fire and requesting immediate assistance. I also sent copies to 3 newspapers in Helena and 1 in San Francisco. If the mine owners wanted to keep this quiet, they've failed. By tomorrow, everyone will know they're using arson as a business tactic." "Won't that just make them more desperate?" Mara asked. "Perhaps. But it also raises the stakes. Right now they're operating in shadow, using methods they can deny. Once the newspapers publish, everything they do will be scrutinized. They'll have to be more careful, which gives us room to maneuver." She left them with ointment for burns and a promise to bring more supporters to the town meeting. After she'd gone, Mara finally changed out of her ruined nightdress and sat at the table with Eli, the 2 of them holding hands in silence. "I'm scared, Mama," Eli whispered. "Me too, baby." "Are we doing the right thing?" Mara looked at Caleb, who was standing at the window watching the road. He turned to meet her eyes, and in that moment they had an entire conversation without words. Should we run? Should we surrender? Should we risk everything for a principle that might get us killed? "Yes," Mara said finally, squeezing Eli's hand. "We're doing the right thing. Sometimes doing right means being scared and doing it anyway." The next 2 days blurred together in a haze of preparation and vigilance. True to Otto's word, volunteers came in shifts to watch the ranch. Miners who'd gotten sick, shopkeepers who'd lost family, even the school teacher who'd testified against Mara at the custody hearing and was now trying to make amends. They brought food, supplies, stories of their own losses to the mine's greed. Caleb spent the time fortifying what could be fortified and planning escape routes if things went wrong. He cached supplies in 3 locations beyond the ranch boundaries: food, money, weapons, places they could run to if the cabin became untenable. He taught Eli the locations, made him memorize landmarks, because children who knew how to survive had better odds than children who depended on adults to save them. Mara used the time to prepare her testimony, writing and rewriting until the words were sharp enough to cut. She practiced in front of Caleb, her voice growing stronger each time, until she could recite Thomas's documentation without her hands shaking. She was becoming someone new, Caleb realized. Not the woman who'd stood terrified in her doorway 3 weeks ago, but someone harder, someone who'd learned to weaponize her grief. The morning of the town meeting dawned cold and clear. Mara dressed in her best clothes, the dark blue calico she'd worn to the courthouse, mended and pressed. Eli wore his Sunday shirt and tried to comb his unruly hair into submission. Caleb cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. aware that he was preparing for war while hoping for peace. They left at 7, joining a small convoy of wagons heading into Stillwater. Otto rode ahead, Jackson and 2 others flanked them, and Dr. Abernathy brought up the rear in her buggy. It was a show of force and solidarity, and Caleb saw how it changed Mara's posture. She sat straighter, chin lifted, a general leading her troops. The town was packed when they arrived. Every hitching post was full, wagons lined the side streets, and people milled in clusters talking in low, urgent voices. The meeting was set for 9 o'clock in the town hall, a 2-story building that served as courthouse, assembly room, and occasional theater. By 8:30, the crowd was already pushing inside, filling the benches and standing along the walls. Caleb positioned himself near the back, where he could watch the entrances. He spotted Garrett Cole immediately, standing with 4 of his hired men near the side door. Cole saw him too, and they exchanged a look that communicated everything. "I know you're here, I know what you're capable of, and I'm here anyway." The mine owners sat in the front row, 3 men in expensive suits, their faces carefully neutral. Caleb recognized the type. Men who made decisions based on ledgers rather than lives, who could justify anything if the profit margin was sufficient. Behind them sat their supporters, the foremen and supervisors and townspeople whose livelihoods depended on the mine's continued operation. But the other side of the room held different faces. The widows in their mourning clothes, the sick miners with their sunken cheeks and hollow coughs, the children who'd lost fathers. They outnumbered the mine supporters 2 to 1, and their presence changed the atmosphere from a business meeting to something closer to a reckoning. Mayor Carson called the meeting to order at 9 sharp. He was a small, nervous man who'd spent his entire term trying not to offend anyone powerful, and the strain was showing. His hands shook as he read the agenda. Opening statements from the mine owners, response from concerned citizens, open discussion, then a vote on whether to request the territorial marshal to terminate his investigation. The mine superintendent spoke first, a polished man named Whitmore, who could have sold water to a drowning man. He talked about the mine's economic importance, the jobs it provided, the taxes it paid. He expressed deep sympathy for families who'd lost loved ones, but insisted the deaths were tragic coincidences, not criminal negligence. He showed charts and graphs proving the water met all current safety standards, conveniently ignoring that those standards were set by the same territorial officials who profited from mine revenue. It was a masterful performance, designed to make opposition seem hysterical and unreasonable. Caleb watched the crowd's reaction, saw some people nodding, saw doubt creeping in. Whitmore was reminding them what they stood to lose: jobs, stability, the devil they knew versus the chaos of change. Then Dr. Abernathy stood to respond, and the room went quiet. She didn't use charts or graphs, she used names. Robert Chen, dead at 29, leaving a widow and 3 children. William Mackenzie, dead at 41, his lungs so scarred the mortician said they looked like burned leather. Thomas Carter, dead at 34, after documenting everything the mine tried to hide. She read 15 names, 15 men who'd died in 3 years, all with the same symptoms, all after working the mine or living downwind of its drainage. "These aren't statistics," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "These are our neighbors, our husbands, our fathers. And they died because profit mattered more than people." She sat down, and Mayor Carson opened the floor for additional testimony. Otto spoke first, describing his own illness and the mine doctor's dismissiveness. Then came the widows, one after another, sharing stories of medical bills they couldn't pay, children they couldn't feed, promises the mine had made and broken. Mara was scheduled to speak last, and when Mayor Carson called her name, a ripple went through the crowd. She walked to the front with Thomas's journal in her hands, and Caleb saw Cole lean forward slightly, watching her with predatory focus. "My name is Mara Carter," she began, her voice steady and clear. 3 weeks ago, Judge Henley tried to take my son and my land because I asked questions about how my husband died. Questions about poisoned water and sick miners, and a mine that values or more than the people who dig it. She opened the journal and read passages in Thomas's handwriting, descriptions of worsening symptoms and chemical observations and desperate notes about needing to get the evidence to authorities before it was too late. Her voice only broke once, when she read the last entry. "If something happens to me, tell Mara I love her. Tell Eli to be brave." Tell them both this fight was worth it. The silence that followed was absolute. Mara closed the journal and looked directly at the mine owners. 2 nights ago, someone set fire to my ranch, poured kerosene along my fence line, and watched while my family fought to save our home. My son is 8 years old, and he spent that night hauling water buckets while flames tried to take everything we have. This is what happens when people ask questions. This is what happens when you challenge men who think power makes them untouchable. One of the mine owners, a heavy man named Bradshaw, stood abruptly. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Carter. Do you have proof? Do you have proof I don't? Mara shot back. Do you have proof your security chief wasn't there? Do you have proof the men you hired to intimidate me weren't the ones who tried to burn me out? Bradshaw's face reddened. This is outrageous. We're legitimate businessmen, not criminals. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it. Otherwise, these wild claims, are they wild? Dr. Abernathy stood again. Because I have medical records documenting 15 deaths with identical symptoms. I have chemical analysis of water samples showing contamination consistent with mine runoff. I have testimony from dozens of families. How much evidence do you need before profit stops being more important than people? The room erupted. Mine supporters shouted that the evidence was circumstantial, that correlation wasn't causation, that shutting down the mine would destroy the town's economy. Families of the dead shouted back that their loved ones mattered more than money, that justice delayed was justice denied, that they were done being silent. Mayor Carson banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the crowd had moved beyond order. This was 3 years of suppressed grief and anger finding its voice, and no amount of parliamentary procedure could contain it. Then Garrett Cole stood, and something in his movement made everyone go quiet. He walked slowly to the front of the room, his scarred face impassive, his missing fingers a reminder that he was a man acquainted with violence. Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice carrying easily, you've made serious accusations. You've disrupted this town's peace. You've cost good people their jobs. He paused. And you've done it all while harboring a wanted fugitive. The words dropped like stones into still water. Mara's face went pale. Caleb's hand moved to his rifle, but Otto's hand on his shoulder stopped him. Not yet. Not while there were still other options. Mr. Drummond, Cole continued, turning to look directly at Caleb, wanted in Kansas for the murder of 2 men. There's a warrant and a reward. I've already sent word to the territorial marshal. He should be here within the week to collect you. The crowd's murmur shifted, uncertainty spreading, a murderer helping the widow. What did that mean? Could she be trusted if she associated with criminals? But before Cole could press his advantage, someone unexpected stood. Mrs. Chen, the woman who'd spat at Mara's feet just days ago, rose from her seat in the back. Her voice was thin but determined. My husband worked with Thomas Carter. He died 6 months after Thomas. Same symptoms, same lies from the mine doctor about it being natural causes. She looked at Cole. You want to talk about criminals? Look at the men who poisoned my husband. Look at the men who let children drink tainted water because cleanup would hurt their profits. That's the real crime here. Another voice joined hers, then another. The schoolteacher stood and apologized publicly for her earlier testimony against Mara. Jackson, the livery worker, described finding 3 of Cole's men near the Carter ranch the night of the fire. One by one, people who'd been silent found their courage, and the narrative Cole had tried to construct began to crumble. Caleb watched it happen with a kind of awe. This was what Thomas Carter had died for, not a courtroom victory, but a community finding its spine. It was messy and imperfect and might not last, but for this moment, in this room, truth was winning. Whitmore, the mine superintendent, stood again and tried to regain control. This has descended into mob rule. We came here to discuss facts, not to air grievances and conspiracies. I move that we table this discussion and what? No. The voice was female and came from the side entrance. Everyone turned to see a woman in traveling clothes standing in the doorway, a leather satchel in her hand and the bearing of someone used to authority. You'll finish this discussion now, with all the facts on the table. Mayor Carson squinted. Who are you? Sarah Brennan, investigator with the Territorial Marshal's Office. She walked to the front of the room and set her satchel on the table. I arrived 2 hours ago in response to Dr. Abernathy's telegrams. I've spent the morning reviewing documentation and interviewing witnesses, and I have some questions for the mine owners. The room went electric with tension. Bradshaw and Whitmore exchanged glances, recalculating rapidly. Cole's expression didn't change, but Caleb saw his weight shift, preparing to move if he needed to. Brennan opened her satchel and withdrew a folder. Let's start with the water samples Mrs. Carter provided. I sent them to a chemist in Helena for analysis. The results show arsenic and mercury levels 40 times the acceptable standard. That's not correlation, gentlemen. That's causation. Whitmore stood. We dispute those findings. The chain of custody was documented by Dr. Abernathy and witnessed by 3 independent parties. The samples are admissible. Brennan pulled out another document. I also have affidavits from 11 miners describing systematic cover-ups of safety violations, and a rather interesting set of financial records showing payments from mine ownership to certain territorial officials who were supposed to be regulating water quality. The mine owners section erupted in protests and denials, but Brennan's voice cut through the noise like a knife. There will be a full investigation. The mine is shut down effective immediately pending review. All financial records will be subpoenaed, and anyone who interferes with this investigation will face federal charges. She looked directly at Cole. That includes acts of intimidation, arson, or violence against witnesses. Cole stared back at her, and for a moment Caleb thought the man might actually draw. His hand hovered near his weapon, his jaw tight, and the room held its collective breath. Then Cole smiled, a cold, dead expression that didn't reach his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, Marshal. I'm just here to protect my employer's interests. Then you can protect them from a jail cell if necessary. Brennan turned to Mayor Carson. I'll need office space and access to all municipal records related to the mine. Can you provide that? Carson nodded quickly, relief flooding his face. The decision had been taken out of his hands, and he was clearly grateful for it. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Mine supporters arguing with investigators, families of the dead crying with relief, Cole and his men slipping out the side door before they could be detained. Caleb worked his way through the crowd to Mara, who stood surrounded by well-wishers and people who'd ignored her weeks ago but wanted to align themselves with her now. She saw him and her face transformed, exhaustion and triumph mixing until she looked both ancient and newborn. He took her arm and guided her outside, away from the press of bodies and into the cold morning air. We won, she said, and it sounded like a question. You won. No. She gripped his hand hard. We won. You and me and Eli and everyone who stood up. We won. Dr. Abernathy joined them, her usual composure cracked by something that might have been satisfaction or vindication or simple relief. The territorial governor's office will want testimony. The investigation could take months, but they can't bury this now. Too many witnesses, too much documentation. What about the mine workers? Mara asked. The ones who'll lose their jobs when it shuts down? That's not your fault, Abernathy said firmly. The mine owners created this situation when they chose profit over safety. If workers suffer, that's on the men who ran the operation into the ground, not on you for exposing it. Otto appeared with Eli, the boy's face bright with excitement and confusion. Did we win, Mama? Is it over? Mara pulled him close. It's not over, baby, but we got through the hardest part. Now we just have to hold on while the law does its work. They walked back to the wagons together, a small group surrounded by the larger crowd of townspeople processing what had just happened. Caleb kept watch, aware that victory could make people careless, and careless people died easy. He spotted Cole's men on horseback at the edge of town, watching but not approaching. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the ride in, adrenaline fading into exhaustion. Mara dozed against Caleb's shoulder while Eli chattered about the meeting, reconstructing it with a child's clarity and directness. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was past its peak, and the yard looked peaceful, almost normal. Almost. The burned fence line was a reminder that peace was temporary and had to be defended. They were unloading supplies when Jackson came riding hard up the road, his horse lathered and his face urgent. He pulled up in a cloud of dust. Otto sent me ahead to warn you. Cole and 6 men left town heading this direction about 20 minutes ago. They looked armed and angry. Caleb's stomach dropped. How far behind you? Maybe 15 minutes. I rode hard. Mara, get Eli to the root cellar. Now. Caleb's voice was sharp with command. Jackson, can you shoot? Well enough. Get on the barn roof. You'll have a clear field of fire from there. Caleb was already moving, grabbing his rifle and the ammunition box from the cabin. Don't shoot unless I do, but be ready. Mara hesitated, torn between obeying and arguing. Caleb caught her face in his hands. Trust me, get Eli safe, then come back with your rifle if you want, but he comes first. She nodded and ran for the cabin, calling for Eli. Caleb positioned himself behind the water trough, where he'd have cover and sightlines on both the road and the yard. Jackson scrambled up to the barn roof and called down that he was set. The wait was agonizing. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, his hand steady on the rifle but his mind racing through scenarios. 7 against 2, maybe 3 if Mara came back. Poor odds, but he'd faced worse. The question was whether Cole wanted to kill them or just scare them, and Caleb had a sick feeling he knew the answer. The riders appeared at the bend, moving at a steady trot. Cole in front, 6 men behind him, all armed. They didn't slow as they approached the ranch, and Caleb knew in that moment this wasn't going to end with words. That's far enough, he called when they were 50 yards out. This is private property. Turn around and leave. Cole reined in but didn't retreat. We came to deliver a message, Drummond, from people who don't appreciate being embarrassed in public. Message received. Now leave. Not quite. Cole's hand moved to his gun. See, the problem is you and Mrs. Carter seem to think you won something today. We're here to correct that misunderstanding. Caleb saw the play forming. Cole would keep him talking while the other men spread out, created crossfire. He had seconds to change the dynamic, or this would end badly. You shoot at this ranch, you shoot at a witness under federal protection, Caleb said, keeping his voice level. Marshal Brennan's already investigating. You kill us, you're not solving a problem, you're creating evidence. Maybe. Or maybe accidents happen and the marshal finds you had enemies from your Kansas days who caught up with you. Cole's smile was all teeth. Hard to prove otherwise when there's no one left to testify. Movement at the cabin. Mara appearing with her rifle. She didn't say anything, just took up position at the corner with a clear line of fire. Cole's men saw her and shifted nervously. The math was changing, becoming less certain. Last chance, Caleb said. Right away. Tell your bosses the game's over. They lost. Nobody tells me the game's over. Cole's hand twitched toward his gun. Caleb fired. The shot took Cole's hat clean off his head, the bullet close enough that the man rocked back in his saddle. Before anyone could react, Jackson's rifle barked from the barn roof, and one of Cole's men yelped, clutching his arm where a bullet had grazed him. Next shots don't miss, Caleb called. Your choice. Run or die. For a long, terrible moment, everything balanced on a knife edge. Cole's face was purple with rage, his hand still near his weapon. His men looked at each other, doing the math. 3 rifles with clear shots, Cole's pride versus their lives. One of the hired guns wheeled his horse and rode back toward town. Then another. Then 2 more. Only Cole and 2 loyalists remained, and even they looked uncertain. This isn't over, Cole spat. Yeah, it is. Mara's voice rang clear across the yard. You're done. Your bosses are done. The only question is whether you're smart enough to quit while you're still breathing. Cole stared at her, this woman he'd tried to break, and Caleb saw the moment he accepted defeat. Not because he wanted to, but because staying meant dying, and dying meant losing definitively. You got lucky, Cole said. No, Mara replied. We got stubborn. There's a difference. Cole yanked his horse around and rode away, his 2 remaining men following. They didn't look back, and Caleb kept his rifle aimed at their backs until they disappeared around the bend. The silence after they left was profound. Jackson climbed down from the barn, shaking slightly. Mara lowered her rifle and leaned against the cabin wall, her legs suddenly unsteady. Caleb stood and walked to where Cole's hat lay in the dust. He picked it up, studied the bullet hole 2 inches above the crown, and felt his own hand start to shake. He'd been that close to killing a man, that close to starting a gunfight that might have killed Mara or Jackson or himself. That close to proving he was still the man who'd murdered 2 people in Kansas, still ruled by rage and violence. Mara came to him, took the hat from his hands, and threw it in the dirt. "You did what you had to do. You protected us." "I almost killed him." "But you didn't. You gave him a choice, and he chose to live. That's more mercy than he deserved." Eli emerged from the root cellar, his face pale. "Are they gone?" "They're gone, baby." Mara pulled him close. "They're gone and they're not coming back." But even as she said it, Caleb knew it wasn't quite true. Cole might be gone, but men like him always had replacements. The mine owners might be under investigation, but powerful people had ways of surviving investigations. The fight they'd won today was just one battle in a longer war. Still, looking at Mara and Eli alive and safe, looking at the ranch still standing despite everything thrown at it, Caleb felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or the memory of what hope used to feel like. "We need to report this to Marshal Brennan," Mara said. "Get it on record." "I'll ride to town," Jackson offered. "Tell her what happened. She'll probably want to arrest Cole for attempted assault." "Be careful," Caleb warned. "Cole's wounded pride makes him more dangerous, not less." Jackson nodded and mounted his horse, riding out at a gallop. Caleb and Mara stood together in the yard, watching him go, while Eli investigated Cole's hat with morbid fascination. "You think it's really over?" Mara asked quietly. "The immediate danger, maybe. But there'll be trials, testimony, probably attempts to discredit you. The mine owners won't go down without exhausting every option. I can handle that." She turned to face him. "Question is, can you?" Caleb understood what she was really asking. Was he staying or running? Would he face the warrant from Kansas or disappear before the law caught up? "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to run, but another part—" He trailed off, looking at the ranch, at Eli, at Mara's face turned up toward his. "Another part wants to see this through, whatever that means. It means testifying at trials. It means the law looking into your past. It means risking everything to stand with us." "I know. And you do that? For us?" Caleb thought about Kansas, about years spent running, about the moment he'd grabbed a boy's reins and let himself be pulled into someone else's fight. He thought about how running had solved nothing, protected no one, redeemed nothing. "Yeah," he said, "I would." Mara smiled, and it transformed her face from careworn to beautiful. "Then we'll face it together. All of it. The trials, the threats, whatever comes. Together." She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, and Caleb felt the weight he'd carried for so long begin to shift. Not disappear, it would never fully disappear, but become something he could carry with help instead of alone. The sun was setting when Otto and Dr. Abernathy arrived with 6 townspeople, all armed and ready to defend the ranch if needed. They'd heard about Cole's attack and organized immediately, riding out to make sure the Carters were safe. "We're setting up a watch rotation," Otto announced. "Nobody bothers this ranch without going through us first." "You don't have to do that," Mara protested. "You've already done so much." "We're doing it anyway." "Doctor." Abernathy's tone allowed no argument. "You stood up when the rest of us were too afraid. Now it's our turn to stand with you." They built a fire in the yard and settled in for the night, taking turns on watch while others slept in the barn or on the porch. It felt like a military encampment, makeshift and temporary, but also like something else. A community finding its purpose. People choosing solidarity over safety. Caleb took the midnight watch with Otto, the 2 of them sitting by the fire while the others slept. The old blacksmith packed his pipe and lit it, the tobacco smell mixing with wood smoke. "You know they'll come after you for Kansas," Otto said after a while. "Marshal Brennan seems fair, but she's still a lawman. She'll have to address that warrant." "I know." "You could run. Still time to disappear before she asks the hard questions." "I could." Caleb stared into the flames. "But I'm tired of running. And I think maybe facing what I did, really facing it, not just carrying it, might be the only way to live with it." Otto nodded slowly. "Thomas used to say that justice was like water. It always found its level eventually. Sometimes slow, sometimes fast, but inevitable." He puffed his pipe. "I think you finding your way here, helping Mara, standing with us, that's water finding its level." That's justice working itself out. Or just dumb luck? Maybe. But I prefer Thomas's version. Makes the world feel less random. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to coals and the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. The night was cold and clear and full of possibility. When dawn came gray and quiet, Marshal Brennan arrived at the ranch with Sheriff Doyle and 3 deputies. She'd heard about Cole's attack and was taking statements. Caleb knew this was the moment. She'd ask about his past, demand answers, maybe arrest him right here in front of Mara and Eli. But instead she asked about Cole's exact words, the number of men, whether any shots besides Caleb's and Jackson's had been fired. She documented everything with meticulous care, then stood and brushed off her skirts. Mr. Cole and his associates left town early this morning, headed south, probably to Denver. I've sent word to have them detained for questioning. She paused, her sharp eyes on Caleb. I'll have more questions for you later, Mr. Drummond. Don't leave the territory. No, ma'am. She knew. She absolutely knew about Kansas, and she was giving him time. Why? Maybe because she understood that some debts were more important than others. Maybe because she saw that he was trying to be better than his past. Or maybe she just needed his testimony more than she needed his arrest. Whatever the reason, Caleb felt something unknot in his chest. Not relief exactly. The warrant still existed, the law would still come eventually, but a reprieve. Time to stand with Mara, to help rebuild, to prove he was more than his worst moment. After Brennan left, they stood in the yard and looked at the ranch with new eyes. The burned fence line was still there, ugly and raw. The barn still listed slightly. The hay meadow was decimated. But the cabin stood solid, smoke rising from its chimney, and inside was warmth and life and the possibility of something worth protecting. We've got work to do, Mara said, surveying the damage. Fences to mend, feed to replace, a whole lot of rebuilding. Then we better get started, Caleb replied. They worked through the day side by side, while Eli ran messages and helped where he could. Otto and the others pitched in, and by sunset they'd made real progress. New posts set, wire strung, the beginnings of recovery. That night, after Eli was asleep and the volunteers had gone home, Mara and Caleb sat on the porch in the dark. The air was cold enough to see their breath, but neither moved to go inside. Thank you, Mara said quietly. For staying, for fighting, for being here when I needed someone. Thank you for giving me a reason to stop running. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time. Not speaking, not moving, just being present in the fragile peace they'd fought so hard to create. Somewhere in the darkness, the future waited with all its uncertainties and dangers. But for now, in this moment, they were alive and together, and the stars overhead were the same ones that had shone on Thomas Carter's grave, on the burned fence line, on every battle won and lost. And that, Caleb thought, might just be enough. The weeks that followed moved with the strange rhythm of aftermath, long stretches of quiet, broken by sudden bursts of activity that reminded everyone the fight wasn't truly over. Marshal Brennan established a temporary office in Stillwater and began the methodical work of building her case. She interviewed witnesses, subpoenaed records, and sent samples to territorial chemists for analysis. The mine remained shut down, its gates chained and guarded by federal deputies, while unemployed miners drifted toward other camps or took day work where they could find it. Some blamed Mara for their hardship. She'd see them in town sometimes, faces tight with resentment, and know they were calculating whether feeding their families was worth more than justice for the dead. She couldn't fault them for that arithmetic, even when it hurt. But others came to the ranch with offerings, a bushel of apples, smoked venison, hay cut from their own diminished stores. They didn't always say much, just left their gifts and nodded, a wordless acknowledgement that some fights were worth the cost even when the cost was steep. Caleb spent those weeks rebuilding what the fire had destroyed and fortifying what remained. He replaced the burned fence posts with cedar that would resist rot, strung new wire with proper tension, and cleared additional fire breaks around the buildings. Otto brought scrap lumber from the smithy, and they rebuilt the section of barn that had been threatening to collapse, shoring it up with proper beams and bracing. Eli helped where he could, learning carpentry and animal husbandry in the way children learn when necessity makes teachers of everyone around them. He was quieter now, the easy joy of childhood dimmed by too much adult knowledge. But Caleb saw resilience growing in the boy like muscle from hard work. Eli was becoming someone who could survive, and that mattered more than preserving innocence. 3 weeks after the town meeting, a rider arrived from Helena with official documents. Mara signed for them with shaking hands and brought them inside where Caleb and Eli waited at the table. The envelope bore the territorial seal and felt heavy with consequence. She opened it slowly, pulled out 3 sheets of dense legal text, and began to read. Her expression shifted as she processed the words, cycling through confusion to disbelief to something that might have been vindication. "They're charging them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Bradshaw, Whitmore, 3 members of the town council, and Judge Henley. Criminal negligence, conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of justice." She looked up, eyes bright. "They're actually charging them." Caleb felt relief wash through him, followed immediately by caution. "Charging isn't convicting. They'll have lawyers, political connections, ways to delay and obfuscate." "I know, but it's more than I thought we'd get. More than Thomas ever got." She set down the papers and wiped her eyes. "The trial's scheduled for December in Helena. Marshal Brennan wants me to testify, along with Dr. Abernathy and anyone else willing to speak." "That's 2 months away. A lot can happen in 2 months. Are you trying to scare me?" "I'm trying to keep you realistic." Caleb stood and walked to the window, watching the road from habit. "Powerful men facing prison do desperate things. We've won battles, Mara, but the war's not over." She joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could feel her warmth. "I'm not naive, Caleb. I know what we're up against, but I also know we've come too far to quit now. Thomas died for this. Otto and the others risked everything for this. I'm not backing down because it might get dangerous. It will get dangerous, not might. Then we'll handle it like we've handled everything else, together." The word hung between them, weighted with implications neither had fully addressed. Together. They'd been living and working in close proximity for over a month, falling into domestic rhythms that felt natural but remained undefined. Caleb slept in the barn most nights, but sometimes when threats felt imminent, he'd bed down on the cabin floor. They took meals together, worked side by side, made decisions jointly about the ranch and Eli's education and how to navigate the legal proceedings ahead. It felt like family, but Caleb was afraid to call it that, afraid that naming it would make it real, and real things could be lost. "There's something else in the envelope," Eli said, his young voice breaking the tension. He'd been reading over his mother's shoulder and now held up a second sheet. "It's addressed to Mr. Drummond." Caleb's stomach dropped. He took the paper and saw the territorial marshal's letterhead, Brennan's careful handwriting below it. The message was brief and devastatingly clear. "Mr. Drummond, I have received confirmation of an outstanding warrant from Kansas regarding incidents in 1871. As a federal officer, I am obligated to execute this warrant. Please present yourself at my office in Stillwater by November 1st to address this matter. Failure to comply will result in immediate arrest. Marshal S. Brennan." November 1st, 6 days away. Mara read the letter over his shoulder, her breath catching. No, they can't. You've helped us. You've done nothing wrong here." "I did plenty wrong in Kansas." Caleb folded the letter carefully, his hand steady, despite the fear crawling up his spine. "The warrant's legitimate. I knew it would catch up eventually." "What will they do to you?" "Extradite me back to Kansas for trial. Probably hang me if they can prove I killed those men." He said it matter-of-factly, like discussing crop rotation, because showing fear would make this harder for everyone. Eli's face crumpled. "But you didn't do anything bad. You protected us." "I did do something bad, son. A long time ago, to different people. And now I have to answer for it." "That's not fair." Caleb knelt so he was eye level with the boy. "Fair doesn't always matter. What matters is doing the right thing even when it's hard. I ran from my crimes for years and running didn't make them go away. Maybe facing them will." "Or maybe it'll just get you killed," Mara said, her voice sharp with anger and fear. "There has to be another way. We'll hire a lawyer, fight the extradition, argue self-defense. With what money? And even if we could, it wouldn't change what I did." Caleb stood and walked to the door, needing air and space to think. "I murdered 2 men, Mara. Not in self-defense, not in the heat of battle. I hunted them down and killed them because they'd killed my family. That's not justice. That's revenge. And the law doesn't look kindly on revenge. The law doesn't look kindly on poisoning minors either, but that didn't stop Bradshaw and Whitmore. She followed him to the porch, her hands balled into fists. You think turning yourself in will somehow balance the scales? It won't. It'll just mean one more good man dies while bad ones walk free. I'm not a good man. You are to us. Her voice broke on the words. You're the man who stopped when Eli asked for help. You're the man who taught me to fight back. You're the man who stood with us when everyone else ran. That's who you are now, Caleb, not the man you were in Kansas. He wanted to believe her, wanted to accept the absolution she was offering, the possibility that people could change enough to matter. But the faces of the men he'd killed were etched into his memory, and their blood was on his hands regardless of how much good he'd done since. I have 6 days, he said quietly. I'll use them to make sure you and Eli are protected. After that, I go to Brennan and face whatever's coming. No. Mara grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. No, you don't get to martyr yourself. We fight this. We find a way. There is no way. Then we make one. She was crying now, tears running down her cheeks, and Caleb realized with a jolt that this mattered to her in ways that went beyond gratitude or partnership. You don't get to give up, not after everything, not after... She didn't finish the sentence, but Caleb understood what she couldn't say. Not after I've started to care about you, not after this started feeling like home, not after we've built something that might be worth keeping. He pulled her close, let her cry against his chest while Eli watched from the doorway with ancient eyes in a child's face. They stood like that until the tears stopped and the sun moved past its zenith, marking time in shadows that stretched across the porch. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in the barn loft, staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios and finding no good options. He could run, take a horse and disappear into the territories where Brennan's jurisdiction ended and law was whatever men with guns said it was. He'd survive out there, probably. But he'd also spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, and the Carters would lose whatever protection his presence provided. Or he could stay and face trial, knowing the likely outcome was a rope and a short drop. At least then Mara and Eli would be free of association with a wanted man. At least then his death might mean something beyond just punishment. Around midnight, he heard the barn door creak. Mara slipped inside, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn cold, and climbed the ladder to the loft. She didn't ask permission, just settled beside him on the straw and pulled the blanket over both of them. Eli's asleep, she said. Took him an hour to settle, but he finally went down. You should be sleeping too. Can't. Keep thinking about you in a Kansas jail waiting to hang. She turned to face him in the darkness. Tell me there's a chance. Tell me they might show mercy. I don't know, Mara. Depends on the judge, the prosecutor, whether anyone speaks for me. I didn't exactly leave friends behind when I ran. Then we'll find character witnesses here. Otto, Dr. Abernathy, the families you've helped. They'll testify to who you are now. That's not how the law works. They care about what I did, not who I've become. Then the law's broken. Her voice was fierce in the dark. You're a good man who did a terrible thing after terrible things were done to him. That should matter. That should count for something. Caleb thought about his wife and daughter, about coming home to find them dying from smoke and burns, about the howling emptiness that had consumed him after they were gone. He'd hunted the men responsible with single-minded fury, and when he'd found them, he'd shown no mercy because he'd had none left to give. I don't regret killing them, he said quietly. That's the thing people don't understand. I regret that my family died. I regret running afterward. I regret a lot of things. But killing the men who murdered my wife and daughter, I'd do it again. Mara was silent for a long moment. Then, good. He looked at her, startled. What? Good that you do it again. It means you're capable of protecting what you love even when the cost is high. It means you're not a coward or a victim. It means you're someone who stands his ground. She touched his face in the darkness. I need you to be that man, Caleb, not the one who runs or surrenders, the one who fights. Fighting won't change the warrant. Maybe not, but giving up definitely won't change it. She moved closer, her warmth against him in the cold loft. Promise me you'll fight. Promise me you'll try. Promise me. Her lips were close to his now, her breath warm on his skin. Promise me you won't just roll over and die because you think it's what you deserve. He couldn't promise that. Couldn't promise he'd survive or that fighting would make a difference. But looking at her face in the dim starlight filtering through the loft window, seeing the fierce determination and barely concealed fear, he found himself promising anyway. I'll fight. I'll try. She kissed him then, soft and desperate, and Caleb felt years of isolation crack open. He kissed her back, tasting salt from her tears, feeling her hands grip his shirt like she could anchor him to this moment through sheer will. It wasn't passion exactly. It was something rawer, more essential. Two people who'd lost too much trying to hold on to something that might still be saved. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Mara rested her forehead against his. I can't lose you too, she whispered. I can't bury another person I care about. You might have to. Then we'll make these 6 days count. We'll live enough for a lifetime, just in case. They lay together in the loft until dawn, not sleeping, not talking much, just being present with each other while time continued its relentless march toward November 1st. When the sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, Mara kissed him once more and climbed down the ladder, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and the promise he'd made. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation and small intimacies. Caleb worked himself to exhaustion, finishing every repair he could think of and teaching Mara skills she'd need to run the ranch alone. How to fix the pump when it seized, how to doctor a horse's colic, how to read weather signs and plan accordingly. She absorbed it all with grim determination, and he knew she understood he was preparing her for his absence. Eli shadowed them both, helping with chores but mostly just soaking up their presence like he was storing memories against a coming drought. The boy had grown quieter, more watchful, and Caleb recognized the look in his eyes, the same look he'd seen in mirrors after Kansas, the look of someone learning that the world took things without asking permission. On the 4th day, Otto arrived with Dr. Abernathy and a rail-thin man in a threadbare suit who introduced himself as Samuel Price, attorney at law. He'd come from Helena at Dr. Abernathy's request and spent 3 hours interviewing Caleb about the Kansas incident, taking meticulous notes and asking questions that cut to the bone. The facts aren't favorable, Price said finally, closing his notebook. You killed 2 men in what the law will view as premeditated murder. The third man's testimony will paint you as a vigilante who took justice into his own hands. Unless we can find witnesses who'll testify to the original crime, the fire that killed your family, and establish extreme emotional distress, I'd say your chances at trial are poor. How poor? Mara asked. 70% chance of conviction, 80% chance of hanging if convicted. Price's voice was clinical, detached. I can argue for reduced charges, possibly manslaughter instead of murder, but Kansas courts aren't known for leniency. So what do we do? Otto asked. We build the strongest case we can with what we have. Character witnesses, testimony about Mr. Drummond's actions here in Montana, evidence that he's changed. It won't be enough to acquit him, but it might be enough to spare his life. After Price left, Caleb found Mara in the barn crying over Thomas's old saddle. He sat beside her and she leaned into him, her shoulders shaking. I can't do this again, she said. Can't watch someone I love get destroyed by people who don't care about anything except power and money. You love me? The question came out softer than he intended. She laughed, bitter and broken. Of course I love you, you fool. You think I'd fight this hard for someone who was just passing through? You think I'd let you into my bed if you didn't matter? He hadn't thought about it in those terms, had been too focused on survival to consider the shape of what was growing between them. But hearing her say it made it real, made it something that had weight and consequence. I love you too, he said, and the words felt both terrifying and inevitable. Don't know when it happened, but it did. You and Eli both. You've become my family. Then don't leave us. She gripped his hands hard enough to hurt. Run if you have to. We'll go with you. Start over somewhere they'll never find us. You know we can't. You've got the trial in December. Testimony the territory's counting on. You run now. Everything we've fought for collapses. I don't care about the trial. I care about you. You do care about the trial. You care about making sure Thomas's death meant something, about getting justice for all those miners, about proving that regular people can stand up to powerful ones and win. That's who you are, Mara. Don't throw it away for me. She pulled back, her eyes searching his face. You're really going to turn yourself in? Yes. And you think there's a chance you'll survive? A small one, but yes. Then I'm coming with you to Brennan's office tomorrow. You don't face this alone. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the sky threatening early snow. Caleb dressed carefully in his cleanest shirt and the good vest Mara had mended for him. He shaved for the first time in weeks, studying his reflection in the scrap of mirror and seeing a man he barely recognized, older, harder, but also somehow more present than the ghost who'd ridden into Montana months ago. Eli insisted on coming despite Mara's protests, and in the end they all rode to Stillwater together. The town was quiet, most people staying indoors against the weather, and Brennan's temporary office was a converted storefront near the old courthouse. The marshal looked up when they entered, unsurprised. Mr. Drummond, you're a day early. Seemed better than spending another night wondering. Caleb removed his hat. I'm here to surrender myself regarding the Kansas warrant. Brennan studied him for a long moment, then gestured to a chair. Sit, all of you. They sat, Mara and Eli flanking Caleb like guards, while Brennan pulled out a folder thick with papers. She opened it and began reading, her voice carefully neutral. Caleb James Drummond, wanted in Leavenworth County, Kansas, for the murder of John Hardesty and Robert Kemp in March 1871. The warrant alleges you tracked these men for 3 weeks following a fire at your homestead that killed your wife Elizabeth and daughter Sarah, ages 32 and 6 respectively. You shot Hardesty in a saloon in Lawrence and beat Kemp to death in an alley in Topeka. A third man, William Moss, escaped and filed the complaint. She looked up. Is this accurate? Yes, ma'am. Do you dispute any of the facts? No, ma'am. I killed them both. Did it deliberately and would do it again. Mara flinched beside him. Brennan's expression didn't change. Mr. Moss's statement claims you acted without provocation, that the fire was an accident and you used it as an excuse for murder. Is that accurate? No, ma'am. The fire was deliberate. They set it because we wouldn't leave land they wanted. I know because I saw them riding away and I found the kerosene cans they'd left behind. Can you prove that? No, ma'am. The evidence burned with my family. Brennan made a note. The county sheriff at the time declined to investigate, claiming insufficient evidence. That same sheriff, Peter Dalton, was later removed from office for corruption related to land fraud. That's interesting timing. Caleb's pulse quickened. I didn't know that. I made some inquiries. Brennan pulled out another document. Sheriff Dalton was taking payments from the Hardesty Land Company, which was attempting to consolidate homesteads in your area through intimidation and fraud. John Hardesty was the owner. His associates, Kemp and Moss, handled the dirty work. You're saying the law was corrupt, Mara said, that Caleb had no legal recourse. I'm saying the situation was more complex than Mr. Moss's statement suggests. Brennan closed the folder. I'm also saying that Kansas justice and territorial justice aren't always aligned, and I have some discretion about how quickly I execute warrants. Hope flickered in Caleb's chest, fragile and dangerous. What are you saying, Marshal? I'm saying I need you alive and available to testify in the mine case. Your testimony about the fire at Mrs. Carter's ranch, about Garrett Cole's threats, about the pattern of intimidation, that's evidence I can't replace. If I extradite you now, I lose a critical witness. So you're delaying the warrant? Mara's voice rose with hope. I'm prioritizing my cases. The mine prosecution is active and urgent. Kansas had 13 years to locate Mr. Drummond and chose not to pursue him aggressively. They can wait a few more months. She looked at Caleb directly. But understand, this is a delay, not a dismissal. After the mine trial concludes, I will execute this warrant. You'll go back to Kansas to face charges. And if the Kansas court convicts him? Mara asked. Then he serves whatever sentence they impose. But Mr. Drummond, I'll make sure they have the full context, not just Moss's version, but the evidence of corruption, the lack of investigation into your family's deaths. Everything. I can't promise it'll change the outcome, but it might give you a fighting chance. Caleb absorbed this. The reprieve that wasn't quite a reprieve,
the hope that came with strings attached. "Thank you, Marshal. That's more fairness than I expected." "Don't thank me yet. I'm still going to put you on a train to Kansas eventually, just not today." She stood, signaling the meeting was over. "The mine trial is scheduled for December 15th in Helena. I need you there to testify. Until then, you're free to move about the territory, but you're not to leave it. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Drummond? Don't make me regret this decision."
They left the office in stunned silence, walking to the wagon through light snow that had started to fall. Eli was grinning, not fully understanding, but sensing good news. Mara's hand found Caleb's and squeezed hard. "You have until December," she said. "Maybe longer if the trial runs late or there are appeals. That's time, Caleb. That's a chance. It's a postponement. Doesn't change the ending. Maybe not. But it gives us time to find witnesses, to build a better defense, Mara." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "We can't spend the next months pretending I'm not still heading for a noose. We have to be realistic." "Fine. We'll be realistic. Realistically, you have months instead of days. Realistically, we have a lawyer who's willing to fight. Realistically, there's evidence of corruption that might create reasonable doubt." She cupped his face in her hands. "Realistically, we have time, so let's use it." They rode back to the ranch through falling snow, and Caleb felt the weight shift again. Not disappearing, but becoming bearable. He had months to help Mara prepare for the trial, to teach Eli what he needed to know, to maybe build something strong enough to survive his eventual absence. The snow continued through the afternoon, covering the burned fence line and the scorched meadow in clean white, making the ranch look almost peaceful. They worked in the barn together, mucking stalls and checking supplies, falling into familiar rhythms that felt precious now that they had an expiration date. That night, after Eli was asleep, Mara came to the barn again. She didn't speak, just climbed into the loft and lay beside Caleb, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. "Your wife and daughter. What were they like?" Caleb had spent 13 years not talking about Elizabeth and Sarah, locking their memory away because the pain was too much to bear. But lying here with Mara, feeling her warmth against him, he found he wanted to remember, needed to remember, maybe, to make them real again, instead of just ghosts that haunted him. Elizabeth was practical, good with numbers, better with people. She could talk a cattleman into selling at half price and make him feel like he'd won the negotiation. He smiled at the memory. She kept me grounded. I'd get ideas about expanding too fast or trying something risky, and she'd sit me down with the ledger and show me exactly why it wouldn't work. I pretended to be annoyed, but I loved that about her. She saw the world as it was, not as I wanted it to be. "She sounds perfect for you." She was. And Sarah, his voice caught. Sarah was 6 years old and afraid of nothing. She'd chase snakes just to see them move, climb trees that terrified me, demand to help with work that was too hard for her. Elizabeth used to say Sarah got her fearlessness from me, but I think it came from knowing she was loved. She never doubted we'd keep her safe. "Until you couldn't." "Until I couldn't," he agreed, the old guilt rising. "I was supposed to protect them. That was my job, my purpose. And I failed." Mara was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "You didn't fail them, Caleb. Evil men killed them. You did everything you could." "I killed the men who murdered them. That's not the same as protecting my family." "No, but it's justice, and justice matters. It's what I've been fighting for with Thomas. It's what the whole mine trial is about, making sure the people who cause harm face consequences." She propped herself up to look at him. "You gave your family justice even though it cost you everything. That's not failure, that's love." He'd never thought of it that way, that hunting down his family's killers was an act of love rather than just vengeance. But maybe Mara was right. Maybe both things could be true at once. "I'm scared," he admitted, "of going back to Kansas, of facing trial, of leaving you and Eli. I'm scared I'll lose everything again." "Then we'll be scared together, and we'll fight together, and whatever happens, we'll know we tried." She kissed him softly. That's all anyone can do. They made love that night in the barn loft, slow and tender and desperate,
two people trying to hold on to each other against the inexorable pull of time and law. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the blanket, and Caleb thought about the strange path that had brought him here. From Kansas to the mountains, from murderer to protector, from isolation to this fragile, precious connection. The weeks until the trial passed in a strange suspension, time moving both too fast and too slow. Caleb worked the ranch with focused intensity, making sure every system was as solid as he could make it. He repaired the plow, reshoed the horses, cut and stacked enough firewood to last through 2 winters. He was building a legacy, he realized, something that would remain after he was gone. Eli followed him everywhere, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. The boy was learning not just skills, but philosophy, how to approach problems methodically, how to stay calm in crisis, how to protect what mattered. Caleb saw Thomas in the boy sometimes, that same stubborn integrity, and it made his chest ache with pride and loss. Mara prepared for her own testimony, working with Samuel Price to organize Thomas's documentation into a coherent narrative. She wrote out her statement longhand, practicing until she could recite it without breaking, until the words became armor against the questions she'd face. On December 10th, they loaded the wagon and started for Helena. The journey took 4 days through early winter weather, the roads frozen hard and the nights brutally cold. They camped alongside other families heading to the trial, forming a small caravan of witnesses and supporters who'd decided this fight mattered enough to brave the elements. Otto rode with them, along with Dr. Abernathy, Jackson from the livery, and a dozen others. They sang songs around campfires at night and shared stories about the men they'd lost, about the mind's slow poison, about the courage it took to stand up when standing up might cost you everything. Helena appeared on the morning of the 14th, sprawling across the valley floor with the territorial capitol building rising above it like a promise. The city was packed with people drawn by news of the trial, journalists, lawyers, mining interests from across the territory, families of the dead seeking justice. Marshal Brennan had arranged lodging for key witnesses in a boarding house near the courthouse. Caleb, Mara, and Eli shared a small room with a single window overlooking the street, and the close quarters felt both cramped and precious. They had one more night before the trial began, one more night of uncertain peace. That evening, Caleb walked Helena's streets alone, needing air and space to think. The city hummed with anticipation, people gathering in saloons and hotel lobbies to debate the case, to argue about progress versus prosperity, about whether the old ways of doing business could survive in a territory trying to become a state. He found himself at a small church on the edge of town, its doors open and candles lit inside. He hadn't prayed since Kansas, hadn't believed there was anything listening that cared about his petitions. But he went inside anyway, sat in the back pew, and tried to find words for what he felt. Please. It was the only word that came. Please let Mara's testimony matter. Please let the men who killed Thomas face justice. Please let Eli grow up in a world where power doesn't always win. Please let me have been enough. He didn't know if he believed anyone heard. But saying the words helped anyway, made the fear manageable, turned the overwhelming weight of tomorrow into something he could carry. When he returned to the boarding house, Mara and Eli were asleep in the narrow bed, curled together like they'd done since Eli was born. Caleb stood in the doorway watching them, memorizing the scene. Mara's dark blonde hair loose on the pillow, Eli's small hand fisted in his mother's nightgown, the rise and fall of their breathing in the lamplight. This was what he was fighting for. Not abstract justice or legal precedent, but this woman and this boy who'd given him a reason to stop running. If he had to go back to Kansas, if he had to face a noose for his crimes, at least he'd know he'd spent his final months protecting something worth protecting. Tomorrow, the trial would begin. Tomorrow they'd face Bradshaw and Whitmore and the full weight of their lawyers and political connections. Tomorrow they'd find out if truth really could stand against power, if ordinary people could win against extraordinary corruption. But tonight, in this small room in Helena, Caleb Drummond allowed himself to hope. Not for himself necessarily, but for Mara and Eli and all the people who'd stood up when standing up was dangerous. For the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, the right thing was also the winning thing. He lay down on the floor beside the bed, his rifle within reach out of habit, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. Tonight, he was here, and he was loved, and that was enough.
Outside, snow began to fall again, covering Helena in white, and the whole territory seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed by 8 o'clock on the morning of December 15th, every bench filled and people standing 3 deep along the walls. Caleb positioned himself where he could watch both the defendants and the exits, his hand never straying far from the space where his rifle would have been if weapons had been allowed inside. Mara sat in the front row reserved for witnesses, her hands folded in her lap with Thomas's journal resting on top of them like a talisman. Eli sat beside her, small and solemn in his good clothes, looking older than his 8 years. The defendants entered through a side door flanked by guards. Bradshaw and Whitmore wore expensive suits and carried themselves with the arrogance of men who'd never truly believed consequences would find them. The 3 town councilmen looked more nervous, their eyes darting around the courtroom like trapped animals. Judge Henley came last, his face carefully blank, and when his gaze swept past Mara, he showed no recognition, no acknowledgement that he'd once tried to destroy her. The territorial judge presiding was a woman named Margaret Holloway, which surprised everyone who hadn't been following territorial politics. She was perhaps 60, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, and she brought the court to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel that cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "This is a criminal proceeding under territorial jurisdiction," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The defendants stand accused of criminal negligence resulting in death, conspiracy to defraud, obstruction of justice, and corruption of public officials. These are serious charges that strike at the heart of what kind of territory we wish to be, one where power and wealth place individuals above the law, or one where justice applies equally to all citizens regardless of station." She paused, letting the words settle. "I will tolerate no disruptions, no intimidation of witnesses, and no attempts to turn this proceeding into theater. We are here to determine facts and apply law. Nothing more, nothing less." The prosecutor was a lean man named Harrison Webb, who'd made his reputation fighting corruption in the mining districts. He stood and began methodically laying out the case, presenting chemical analyses of water samples that showed arsenic and mercury at lethal levels, medical records documenting the pattern of deaths, testimony from miners about suppressed safety reports, and threats against those who complained. The defense attorneys objected constantly, challenging chains of custody and the reliability of witnesses, arguing that correlation wasn't causation and that the mine had followed all existing regulations. But Webb had anticipated every argument, producing documentation that the regulations themselves had been written by officials on the mine's payroll, that inspections had been falsified, that warnings from territorial chemists had been ignored or destroyed. Dr. Abernathy testified first among the witnesses, presenting her ledger of deaths with clinical precision. She read names and dates and causes of death as written by the mine doctor, then presented her own findings based on autopsies she'd performed privately. The discrepancies were damning. Men listed as dying from pneumonia had lungs scarred by chemical burns. Children listed as succumbing to fever showed clear signs of heavy metal poisoning. "How many deaths do you attribute directly to mine contamination?" Webb asked. "At minimum, 23 in the past 4 years. Possibly as many as 35 if we include cases where documentation was destroyed or bodies were buried without examination." Dr. Abernathy's voice remained steady, professional. "This doesn't include the 47 residents currently suffering from symptoms consistent with chronic poisoning who will likely die in the coming years." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway called for silence. The defense attorney, a polished man named Cyrus Blackwood, stood for cross-examination. "Dr. Abernathy, you're a small-town doctor with no specialized training in toxicology, correct?" "I'm a licensed physician with 23 years of practice. I've studied under toxicologists in San Francisco and maintained correspondence with specialists across the country. But you're not an expert." "I know poison when I see it, Mr. Blackwood. And I've seen it kill my patients for 4 years while men in expensive suits told me I was mistaken." Blackwood tried several more angles, but Abernathy deflected them all with the calm authority of someone who'd spent months preparing. When he finally gave up and dismissed her, she walked past the defendant's table without a glance, her head high. Otto testified next, describing his own illness and the mine's systematic denial of responsibility. Then came the widows, one after another, each telling the same story with different details. Husbands who'd gotten sick, mind doctors who'd dismissed symptoms, company lawyers who'd offered pittance settlements in exchange for silence. The defense tried to paint them as opportunists seeking easy money, but the women's grief was too raw, too real to dismiss. Mrs. Chen broke down completely when describing how her husband had coughed blood for 3 months before dying, how the mind doctor had insisted it was tuberculosis despite every sign pointing to poison, how she'd been left with 4 children and $17. By noon, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to outrage. Judge Holloway called a recess, and Caleb found Mara in the hallway, pale but composed. "You're next," he said. "After lunch." "I know." She gripped Thomas's journal tighter. "I'm ready." "You don't have to be ready. You just have to tell the truth." She looked at him then, and he saw the fear beneath her determination. What if it's not enough? What if they find some technicality and these men walk free? Then we've still done what Thomas would have wanted. We've made them answer, made them defend themselves in front of the whole territory. That matters, Mara. Win or lose, that matters. They ate lunch at a small restaurant near the courthouse, barely tasting the food. Eli picked at his plate and asked questions about what would happen next. Whether the bad men would go to jail, whether they'd be safe now. Mara answered with more confidence than she felt, and Caleb saw her transforming again, becoming the mother who could promise safety even when safety was uncertain, who could project strength even when terrified. The afternoon session began with Mara being called to the stand. She walked to the witness chair with her spine straight and her eyes forward, and when she was sworn in, her voice didn't waver. Webb began gently, establishing her marriage to Thomas, their purchase of the ranch, the early years when everything had seemed possible. "When did you first become aware of problems with the mine?" Webb asked. "About 2 years before my husband died. He started coughing, having trouble breathing. The mine doctor said it was dust from working underground, told him to stay hydrated and rest. But Thomas hadn't worked the mine in 3 years. He'd left specifically because he was worried about the conditions there." "What made him worried?" "Other miners getting sick, water that tasted wrong coming from the creek downstream of the mine, livestock dying for no clear reason." Mara opened Thomas's journal. He started documenting everything, dates, symptoms, observations. He was going to take it to the territorial authorities. What prevented him? "He died 3 days before he planned to mail the letters." Her voice finally cracked, but she pushed through. "Lung fever," the doctor said. "But I've read Dr. Abernathy's findings. I know what really killed him." Webb took her through the aftermath, the missing journal, the water samples Thomas had buried, the custody hearing designed to silence her. He introduced the journal as evidence and had Mara read several passages. Thomas's careful handwriting describing his worsening condition with the detached precision of a man who knew he was documenting his own death. Then Webb asked about the fire. 2 nights before the town meeting, someone set fire to our north fence line. They used kerosene, poured it deliberately to spread fast. My son was 8 years old, and he spent that night hauling water while we fought to save our home." "Do you know who set the fire?" "I saw 3 riders watching from the road. One of them was Garrett Cole, head of security for the mine. He raised his hand to us before riding away." Blackwood objected immediately, claiming the identification was uncertain and inflammatory. Judge Holloway sustained the objection, but noted that testimony about the fire itself was admissible. When Webb finished, Blackwood stood for cross-examination. He was smooth, practiced, dangerous. He started by questioning whether Thomas's death was really connected to the mine, suggesting other possible causes. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, simple bad luck. Mara answered each question with facts from the journal and Dr. Abernathy's findings. Then Blackwood shifted tactics. "Mrs. Carter, isn't it true that you're harboring a wanted fugitive? A man named Caleb Drummond, wanted for murder in Kansas?" The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway's gavel rang out repeatedly before order was restored. Mara's face had gone white, but when she spoke, her voice was steady. "Mr. Drummond stopped at my ranch when my son asked for help. He's worked our land, protected us from intimidation, and testified truthfully about what he's witnessed. Whatever happened in Kansas 13 years ago has no bearing on the crimes committed by these defendants." "It speaks to your judgment, Mrs. Carter, to your credibility. You've aligned yourself with a killer. Why should this court believe anything you say? Because I have evidence. Mara held up the journal. Because Dr. Abernathy has medical records. Because 23 families have buried loved ones. Because the truth doesn't change based on who's speaking it. Blackwood tried several more angles, but Mara held firm, and eventually he dismissed her with obvious frustration. As she stepped down, she looked at Caleb in the gallery, and he saw triumph there. She'd done it. She'd stood up to the lawyers and the intimidation and told Thomas's story without breaking. The prosecution called 2 more witnesses before the day ended, a territorial chemist who explained in technical detail how the water samples showed deliberate contamination, and a mine foreman who'd resigned rather than continue falsifying safety reports. Both testimonies were devastating, laying out a pattern of conscious disregard for human life in pursuit of profit. That night, back at the boarding house, Mara collapsed into Caleb's arms and finally let herself shake. I thought Blackwood was going to destroy me up there. Thought he'd twist everything until I looked like a liar or a fool. You were magnificent, Caleb said, holding her tight. You answered every question with truth and dignity. Thomas would have been proud. I wish he could have seen it. Wish he could have been here to watch these men finally answer for what they did. He knows. Somewhere, somehow, he knows. Eli was already asleep in the bed, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Mara and Caleb sat by the window watching snow fall over Helena, and Caleb thought about how much had changed since that day at the river when a desperate boy had grabbed his reins. He'd been so certain then that other people's fights weren't his concern, that isolation was safety. Now here he was, in a boarding house in Helena, holding a woman he loved while waiting to testify in a trial that might change everything. Tomorrow's your turn, Mara said quietly. Webb wants you to testify about the threats and the fire, about Cole and his men. I know. Blackwood will bring up Kansas again. Try to make you look like a violent criminal whose testimony can't be trusted. Let him try. I've got nothing to hide anymore. Caleb kissed the top of her head. I killed those men because they murdered my family. I'm not ashamed of that, and I helped you because it was right. That's the truth, and truth's all I've got. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold. Caleb dressed carefully, knowing appearance mattered in these settings, and walked to the courthouse with Mara and Eli. The crowd had grown even larger, word having spread about the trial's dramatic testimony, and reporters from 3 territorial newspapers had arrived to cover the proceedings. When Caleb was called to testify, he felt the weight of every eye in the room. He took the oath with his hand on the Bible and tried not to think about the irony, a killer swearing to tell the truth under the eye of a deity he wasn't sure existed. Webb established his presence at the Carter Ranch, his observations of the fire, his interactions with Garrett Cole. Caleb testified in clear, direct language about the threats, the intimidation, the systematic campaign to silence Mara. He described finding the oiled rags after the fire, the boot prints in the dirt, the riders watching from the road. Did you recognize any of these riders? Webb asked. 3 of them, Garrett Cole and 2 men he'd hired for mine security. I'd seen them before when they came to the ranch to threaten Mrs. Carter. What was the nature of these threats? They told her to drop her complaints about the mine, or there would be consequences. They offered money to sign away her rights. When she refused, they made it clear those consequences would include taking her son and destroying her property. Webb introduced Caleb's testimony about shooting Cole's hat off during the confrontation, which drew gasps from the gallery. He explained it as a warning shot, a way to de-escalate without killing anyone, and Judge Holloway noted that self-defense on one's own property was legally justified. Then Blackwood stood for cross-examination, and Caleb felt the atmosphere change. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the confrontation between the defense and the fugitive. Mr. Drummond, you're wanted for murder in Kansas, correct? Yes. You killed 2 men in cold blood. I killed 2 men who murdered my wife and daughter. There was nothing cold about it. But you killed them nonetheless, hunted them down and executed them without trial, without due process. You took the law into your own hands. Caleb met Blackwood's eyes steadily. I did. The local sheriff was corrupt, paid off by the men who'd ordered the fire. There was no law to appeal to, no justice available through proper channels, so I found another kind of justice. vigilante justice, the kind that leads to chaos and mob rule, the kind that happens when the system fails, when the people sworn to protect citizens instead protect the powerful. Caleb gestured toward the defendants. Just like what happened here in Stillwater. Just like what these men did when they poisoned water and bought off officials and silenced anyone who complained. Blackwood's face reddened. You're comparing yourself to Mrs. Carter? Trying to justify murder by wrapping it in noble intentions? I'm saying that sometimes people have to stand up when the law won't. Mrs. Carter did it by gathering evidence and demanding a trial. I did it differently, and I've paid the price. 13 years running, a warrant that'll eventually catch me, probably a noose waiting in Kansas. But I'd do it again, because some things matter more than following rules written to protect the guilty. The courtroom erupted in shouts and arguments. Judge Holloway's gavel rang out like gunshots, calling for order. When silence finally returned, she looked at Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. Mr. Drummond, this court is not here to adjudicate your actions in Kansas. However, I note for the record that your testimony regarding events in Montana has been corroborated by multiple witnesses and physical evidence. The defense may question your character, but they cannot dismiss the facts you've presented. Blackwood tried several more angles, but Caleb held steady, refusing to be rattled or provoked into angry outbursts. When he was finally dismissed, he walked past the defendant's table and saw fear in their eyes for the first time. They'd expected a criminal they could discredit, but instead, they'd gotten someone who wouldn't back down, who spoke truth with the conviction of a man who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. The trial continued for 3 more days. The prosecution presented financial records showing payments from mine ownership to Judge Henley and 2 town councilmen. They showed correspondence between Bradshaw and territorial officials discussing how to suppress reports of contamination. They presented testimony from miners who'd been threatened or fired for raising safety concerns. The defense fought back with experts who challenged the water analysis, with character witnesses who praised the defendant's contributions to the community, with arguments about economic necessity and the greater good. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming, and even Blackwood's considerable skill couldn't erase the pattern of conscious disregard for human life. On the 4th day, both sides rested, and Judge Holloway announced she would render her verdict the following morning. The territorial system didn't use juries for criminal cases. Judges decided both guilt and sentencing, which meant everything rested on one woman's interpretation of law and evidence. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He paced the small room while Mara and Eli dozed fitfully, his mind running through every possible outcome. Conviction seemed likely based on the evidence, but powerful men had ways of escaping justice even when caught. And if the defendants were acquitted, what then? Would the harassment resume? Would Cole come back with more men and deadlier intentions? Around 3 a.m, he gave up on sleep and went downstairs. He found Marshall Brennan sitting in the boarding house parlor, also awake, a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside her. Couldn't sleep either? She asked. Too much writing on tomorrow. Yes. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. I want to talk to you about Kansas. Caleb's stomach tightened, but he sat. What about it? I've been corresponding with authorities there. The original sheriff, Peter Dalton, was removed from office in 1873 for corruption. He died in 1876, drunk and disgraced. The prosecutor who issued your warrant was disbarred in 1878 for taking bribes. She sipped her coffee. The third man, William Moss, disappeared in 1880. No one's seen him since. So the warrant is still valid, technically, but the case is 13 years old, the key witnesses are dead or missing, and the context has changed significantly. I spoke with the current Kansas district attorney. He's willing to review the charges if you return voluntarily, and if we can provide evidence of the original fire and the corruption around it. Hope flickered, dangerous and fragile. What are you saying? I'm saying you might not hang. The DA might accept a plea to manslaughter, time served given the years you've been in exile. Or he might dismiss altogether if we can prove the original crime was never properly investigated due to corruption. Brennan set down her cup. But you'd have to go back, face it. Trust the system you've been running from. And if the system fails again, then at least you'll know you tried. At least you'll be able to live with yourself knowing you faced your crimes instead of running forever. Caleb thought about Mara and Eli, about the ranch waiting back in Montana, about the possibility of a life that wasn't defined by flight and fear. If I go back and they do convict me, what happens to the Carters? Who protects them? The mind shut down pending resolution of this trial. If Judge Holloway convicts, and I believe she will, the owners will face prison and bankruptcy. The threat to Mrs. Carter ends when the money runs out. Brennan leaned forward. But I understand your concern. If you need to stay until she's settled, until you're certain she's safe, I can delay the Kansas transfer a few more months. Why are you helping me? Because I've seen the evidence from both cases, Kansas and Montana. And I think maybe justice isn't always about rigid application of law. Sometimes it's about understanding context, about recognizing that good people can do terrible things when pushed beyond endurance, and that punishment should account for remorse and reformation. She stood. Get some sleep, Mr. Drummond. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. The courthouse was standing room only when Judge Holloway entered at 9 o'clock sharp. She carried a thick folder of notes, and her expression revealed nothing. The defendants sat rigid in their chairs, their expensive lawyers flanking them like armor. Mara gripped Caleb's hand so hard his fingers went numb. Judge Holloway settled behind her bench, adjusted her spectacles, and began to read. I have considered the evidence presented over 4 days of testimony, including chemical analyses, medical records, witness statements, and financial documentation. I have reviewed territorial law regarding criminal negligence, conspiracy, and corruption. And I have reflected on what kind of precedent this court wishes to set for how we treat our most vulnerable citizens. She paused, looking directly at the defendants. The evidence shows a systematic pattern of conduct that placed profit above human life. The defendants knew the mine's drainage was contaminating water supplies. They knew workers were getting sick and dying. They knew families downstream were being poisoned. And rather than address these problems through proper remediation and safety protocols, they chose concealment, falsification of records, and intimidation of witnesses. Bradshaw's lawyer started to rise, but Judge Holloway silenced him with a look. This was not negligence born of ignorance. This was conscious, deliberate disregard for the lives and well-being of citizens under the defendant's power. They used their wealth and influence to corrupt officials, suppress investigations, and silence opposition. They turned law itself into a weapon against those seeking justice. Her voice hardened. I find all 5 defendants guilty on all charges. Sentencing will be as follows. Harold Bradshaw and Edward Whitmore, as primary owners and operators, 15 years in territorial prison and forfeiture of all assets related to mine operations. The 3 town councilmen, as accomplices, 7 years in territorial prison and permanent removal from public office. Additionally, I am referring Judge Samuel Henley to the territorial bar for disbarment proceedings. The courtroom exploded. People shouted, cried, embraced. The defendants sat in stunned silence while their lawyers immediately began talking about appeals. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering the establishment of a compensation fund from the seized mine assets. Families of the deceased will receive payment commensurate with lost wages and suffering. Residents suffering ongoing health effects will receive medical care at mine expense. And the territorial government will conduct full environmental remediation of contaminated areas. She banged her gavel. This court stands adjourned. Mara was crying, laughing, pulling Eli into her arms while Dr. Abernathy and Otto surrounded them with congratulations. Caleb stood slightly apart, watching the scene unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy. They'd won. After months of fighting, after loss and fire and threats and fear, they'd actually won, but his own reckoning was still coming. That evening, after the celebration dinner with all the witnesses and supporters, after Eli had finally fallen asleep exhausted by excitement, Mara found Caleb on the boarding house roof. He'd climbed up to watch stars emerge over Helena, to process everything that had happened, to prepare for what came next. You're leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Not tomorrow, but soon. I need to go back to Kansas. Face what I did. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Brennan told me about her conversation with the Kansas DA. Said there's a chance they might reduce charges. A chance, not a certainty. Better odds than we had with the mine trial. She took his hand. Come back to the ranch first. Spend winter with us. Let Brennan handle the negotiations with Kansas. Don't rush toward a noose when you might not need to. He wanted to say yes, wanted to steal a few more months of this life before facing judgment. But he also knew that waiting would just make the leaving harder, would give him more to lose and more reason to run again. I can't, Mara. If I wait, I'll find excuses to wait longer. I'll convince myself to run, to disappear into the territories where law can't reach. And I'll spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, never free, never at peace. So you're choosing Kansas over us. I'm choosing to face my past so I might have a future. There's a difference. She was quiet for a long time, watching the stars. Finally, I'm going with you. No. Yes. You're not doing this alone. Eli can stay with Dr. Abernathy. She's already offered. You and I will go to Kansas together. I'll testify about the man you are now, about what you've done for us. I'll make them see you're not just the crimes you committed. Mara, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. You stood with me when I had nothing and no one. Now I'm standing with you. She turned to face him. Besides, you're not the only one who's stubborn. If you think I'm letting you walk into a Kansas courtroom alone, you don't know me very well. Caleb felt something break open in his chest, all the careful isolation he'd built over 13 years crumbling in the face of this woman's fierce loyalty. I love you, he said, and it felt like both a confession and a promise. I love you too, which is why we're doing this together. She kissed him softly. Now come inside. Tomorrow we start planning how to save your life. They spent the next week in Helena while Marshal Brennan arranged transport and communicated with Kansas authorities. Samuel Price agreed to accompany them as legal counsel, and Dr. Abernathy insisted on coming as a character witness. Otto wanted to join as well, but someone needed to watch the ranch, so he agreed to stay behind with Eli and keep things running. The night before they left, Caleb had a long talk with Eli. The boy was trying to be brave, but his eyes were red from crying, and Caleb knew the abandonment cut deep. You think you're not coming back, Eli said. That's why you're saying all this stuff about being strong and taking care of Mama. Caleb wouldn't lie to him. I don't know if I'm coming back. The charges are serious and the outcome's uncertain. But I'm going to try, Eli. I'm going to fight to come home to you and your Mama. What if fighting's not enough? Then you'll remember that I loved you, that you and your Mama gave me something worth fighting for, and you'll grow up knowing that sometimes doing the right thing means facing hard consequences, but it's still worth doing. Eli threw himself into Caleb's arms, holding on with desperate strength. You're not allowed to die. I forbid it. Caleb laughed despite the tightness in his throat. I'll do my best to obey. Promise. I promise I'll fight. That's all I can promise. They took the train to Kansas in early January, the landscape rolling past in frozen monotones of white and gray. Mara sat beside Caleb, her hand in his, while Dr. Abernathy and Samuel Price reviewed documents and prepared arguments. The journey took 4 days, plenty of time for doubt to creep in, for Caleb to question whether he was doing the right thing or just committing elaborate suicide. But every time fear threatened to overwhelm him, he'd look at Mara and remember why this mattered. He was doing this so he could stop running, so he could build a life instead of just surviving in the margins. He was doing this because Eli deserved better than a father figure who taught him to run from consequences. Leavenworth appeared on the 5th day, gray and industrial, and far less welcoming than Montana's mountains. The Kansas district attorney, a young reformer named Thomas Green, met them at the station with Marshal Brennan, who'd arrived 2 days earlier to coordinate. Mr. Drummond, Green said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming voluntarily. That speaks well of your intentions. They were taken to the county courthouse where Caleb was formally arrested and processed. The handcuffs felt like defeat, but Mara's presence kept him steady. She insisted on visiting him in the holding cell, bringing food and reassurance, treating his incarceration as a temporary inconvenience rather than a preview of permanent imprisonment. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 days later. Samuel Price spent that time building a defense based on corruption of the original investigation, extreme emotional distress, and Caleb's 13 years of exile as time served. He tracked down the former mortician who'd examined Elizabeth and Sarah's bodies, obtained autopsy records that had been suppressed, found neighbors who'd witnessed the intimidation campaign by the Hardesty Land Company. Dr. Abernathy gave a deposition about Caleb's character and his actions in Montana. Mara testified for 2 hours about how he'd protected her family, how he'd shown restraint even when threatened, how he'd become a different man than the one who'd committed murder in 1871. On the day of the hearing, Caleb was brought into court in shackles. The judge was an older man named Albert Whitmore, no relation to the Montana mine owner, with a reputation for fairness tempered by strict interpretation of law. He reviewed the evidence Price presented, listened to testimony, and asked pointed questions about the original investigation's failures. Then he called a surprise witness, the widow of John Hardesty, the man Caleb had killed in the Lawrence saloon. She was perhaps 50 now, worn by time and hardship. She took the stand and confirmed that her husband had been involved in land fraud, that he'd employed Kemp and Moss to intimidate homesteaders, that the local sheriff had been on their payroll. "Did you know about the fire that killed the Drummond family?" Green asked. "I suspected. John came home that night smelling of kerosene, agitated and drinking heavy. 2 days later, I heard about the deaths, and I knew. I knew what he'd done." "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because I was afraid. Afraid of my husband, afraid of losing my home, afraid of what speaking up would cost me." She looked directly at Caleb. "I'm sorry. I should have testified 13 years ago. Maybe if I had, you wouldn't have felt you needed to take justice into your own hands." The courtroom was silent. Judge Whitmore made notes, his expression unreadable. When all testimony concluded, he announced he would render his decision the following day. Caleb was returned to his cell, where he spent a sleepless night alternating between hope and resignation. Mara visited one last time before being escorted out for the night, and she held his hands through the bars. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we tried," she said. "We told the truth, and we fought. That's all anyone can do. If they convict me, if they convict you, I'll appeal. I'll write to the territorial governor, to newspapers, to anyone who'll listen. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did and why. And I'll keep the ranch going until you can come home, even if it takes years." "Mara, you don't have to wait." "I'm not waiting because I have to. I'm waiting because I choose to. You're my family, Caleb, you and Eli. That doesn't change based on where you're physically located." He kissed her through the bars, tasting salt from both their tears, and tried to memorize everything about this moment. The warmth of her hands, the fierceness in her eyes, the absolute certainty that he'd found something worth living for. The next morning, he was brought back to court for the verdict. The courtroom was less crowded than the Montana trial, but news had spread and curious onlookers filled the back rows. Mara sat in front, flanked by Dr. Abernathy and Samuel Price, all three of them tense with anticipation. Judge Whitmore entered and everyone rose. He settled behind his bench and began to speak without preamble. "This case presents a conflict between law and justice that is not easily resolved. Mr. Drummond committed premeditated murder. That fact is not in dispute. However, the context in which those murders occurred has been significantly clarified by new evidence and testimony." He reviewed the findings: the corrupt sheriff, the suppressed autopsy reports, the pattern of intimidation by the Hardesty Land Company, the lack of any legal recourse available to Caleb in 1871. "The law requires that I hold Mr. Drummond accountable for his actions. Vigilante justice cannot be condoned, regardless of provocation. However, the law also requires that I consider mitigating circumstances, rehabilitation, and the interests of justice broadly understood." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. Mara's hand gripped the bench in front of her. "I find Mr. Drummond guilty of voluntary manslaughter in the deaths of John Hardesty and Robert Kemp. However, I am sentencing him to time served, the 13 years he has spent in exile, plus 5 years probation to be served in Montana Territory under Marshal Brennan's supervision. He will be released immediately with the condition that he reports monthly to territorial authorities and maintains lawful conduct." The gavel fell. Caleb stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just heard. Not guilty of murder. Time served. Released immediately. He was free. Mara was crying. Dr. Abernathy was embracing Samuel Price, and the courtroom buzzed with reaction. A deputy came forward to remove Caleb's shackles, and the moment the metal fell away, he felt a weight lift that had been crushing him for 13 years. He walked to where Mara waited, and she threw her arms around him, holding on like she'd never let go. "You're coming home," she whispered. You're actually coming home." "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am." They left Kansas 3 days later, all the legal paperwork processed and filed. The train carried them back toward Montana through winter landscapes that looked different now, not threatening or alien, but simply the world as it was, beautiful and harsh and full of possibility. When they finally reached Stillwater in late January, Otto and Eli were waiting at the station. Eli saw them and ran, launching himself at Caleb with enough force to nearly knock him over. "You came back! You promised, and you came back!" Caleb held the boy tight, feeling pieces of himself slot into place. "I promised, and I keep my promises." The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours through deep snow. The property looked different under winter's blanket, cleaner, starker, the burned fence line hidden beneath white. But the cabin chimney puffed smoke, and the barn stood solid. And when they pulled into the yard, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. He felt like he was home. The months that followed fell into a rhythm of work and healing. Caleb reported to Marshal Brennan monthly as required, documenting his activities and maintaining lawful conduct. The probation felt less like punishment than like structure, a framework for building the life he wanted rather than running from the one he feared. The compensation fund from the mine trial was distributed in March. Mara received payment for Thomas's death and for the years of contaminated water that had damaged their livestock. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough to buy seed for spring planting, to replace equipment, to hire help for the heavy work. Other families used their compensation to leave Stillwater, seeking fresh starts in places not haunted by loss. But others stayed, forming a tight community of survivors who'd stood together against power and won. They helped each other plant crops, raise barns, rebuild what had been broken. Dr. Abernathy established a clinic with part of her compensation, offering free care to former miners suffering ongoing effects from the poisoning. Otto expanded his smithy and trained young men in metalwork, creating employment for those displaced by the mine closure. Slowly, painfully, Stillwater began to transform from a town defined by extraction and exploitation into something more sustainable, more human. In late April, Caleb asked Mara to marry him. He did it without fanfare, just the two of them on the porch at sunset watching Eli chase chickens in the yard. "I want to make this official," he said. "Want Eli to know I'm not going anywhere, that this is permanent. Want you to have legal protection and my name and everything that comes with being family." Mara smiled, and it was the genuine smile of someone who'd survived the worst and found joy on the other side. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in June in a simple ceremony at the Stillwater Church. Eli stood with them as witness, bursting with pride at his new official father. Otto gave Mara away, and Dr. Abernathy served as matron of honor. Half the town attended, people who'd learned through shared struggle that community mattered more than individual gain. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. People brought food and music, and children who ran wild through the meadow while adults shared stories and laughter. It wasn't fancy or sophisticated, but it was real, a celebration of survival and stubborn hope, and the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, things worked out. As the sun set and lanterns were lit, Caleb found himself standing at the edge of the gathering, watching Mara dance with Eli while Otto played fiddle and Dr. Abernathy clapped along. He thought about the man he'd been when he'd ridden into Montana, hollow, haunted, convinced he deserved nothing but isolation and eventual death. That man was gone now, transformed by the choice to stop running and start standing. He'd faced his crimes and found not absolution exactly, but the possibility of redemption through living well, through protecting what mattered, through choosing every day to be better than his worst moment. "You look contemplative." Mara appeared at his elbow, slightly breathless from dancing. "Just thinking about how far we've come. How much has changed. For the better?" "Definitely for the better." He pulled her close. "I love you, Mrs. Drummond." "I love you too." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Think we'll get our happily ever after?" "I think we already have it. Right here, right now. Everything else is just details." They stood together as the stars emerged and the music played on. Two people who'd survived loss and fear and the long, hard work of rebuilding. The future still held uncertainties, crops that might fail, weather that could turn deadly, the slow recovery of land poisoned for years. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Eli ran up, tugging on Caleb's sleeve. "Papa, come dance. Mama says you have to, because it's your wedding and you can't say no." "Papa." The word still sent warmth through Caleb's chest every time Eli used it. He let the boy pull him toward the makeshift dance floor, Mara laughing beside them. And he thought about Thomas Carter and Elizabeth and Sarah and all the people who'd been lost along the way to this moment. They hadn't died for nothing. Their losses had created the conditions for this life, this family, this stubborn determination to make meaning from tragedy. And while Caleb would have traded anything to have them back, to undo the fires and the poison and the violence, he also knew that wasn't how the world worked. You couldn't change the past. You could only honor it by building a better future. So he danced with his wife and son under the Montana stars, surrounded by people who'd learned that justice was possible when ordinary folks decided it mattered enough to fight for. He danced until his feet hurt and the music slowed and Eli fell asleep on a pile of blankets, exhausted by joy. And when the last guests had left and the lanterns were extinguished and the ranch settled into quiet, Caleb stood on the porch one last time, looking out at the land he'd helped save. "You ready for bed?" Mara called from inside. "In a minute." He stayed a moment longer, breathing in pine and cold air and the smell of home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Caleb Drummond, reformed killer and reluctant hero, felt something he hadn't experienced since Kansas. Peace, not the absence of struggle or the guarantee of easy days ahead, but the deep abiding certainty that he was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was meant to do, surrounded by people who saw his scars and chose to love him anyway. That was enough. That was everything. He went inside to his family, closing the door on the Montana night, and began the rest of his life.